She arrived weighing more than any bride before her, and lasted longer than all of them combined. Every woman who came to Rhett Calloway's mountain left within a week. Some fled in the middle of the night. One walked 14 miles through snow rather than spend another hour under his roof. The frontier laughed at him, the scarred, silent mountain man who could survive anything the wilderness threw at him, but couldn't keep a wife past Sunday. Then Delilah Boone stepped off that wagon, and the laughter got louder. It wouldn't stay loud for long. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button, drop your city in the comments below, and follow along to the very end. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning Rhett Calloway buried his third dog, he did it alone, the way he did everything else. The grave was shallow. The ground had frozen 2 weeks before the calendar said it should, and he'd broken 2 pick handles getting down far enough to matter. He wrapped the old hound in a piece of canvas he'd been saving for a roof patch, set the dog in the ground without ceremony, and covered him up. Then he stood there in the wind for a long moment, not because he was grieving in any way he could name, but because the cold felt appropriate. It matched something inside him he hadn't found words for in years. He was 41 years old. He had killed a mountain lion with a skinning knife, survived 3 blizzards that took other men, and built his cabin with his own hands out of timber he'd cut from trees he'd felled himself. He could track a wounded elk across bare rock. He could read weather in the color of morning clouds. He had been called many things: brutal, strange, impossible, and he accepted all of it the same way he accepted everything the Blackstone Range threw at him, without complaint, without adjustment, without any particular desire to change. That was the problem, according to the women. Or it had been the problem, according to the 3 women who'd come up the mountain in the last 4 years, each of them arranged through the same matchmaking service operating out of Harlan Crossing, the nearest town of any size, sitting 22 miles south of his property line at the base of the foothills. He hadn't sought them out the first time. The first time had been his neighbor's idea, Virgil Pruitt, who ran a decent cattle operation 4 miles east, who had a wife who cooked and a daughter who laughed, and who looked at Rhett's solitary existence with the kind of concerned pity that Rhett found deeply irritating. "You need somebody up here," Virgil had said, leaning on Rhett's porch rail like he owned it. "A man can go strange alone this long." "I'm already strange," Rhett had said. "Stranger then." He'd agreed to the first woman mostly to stop Virgil from bringing it up again. Her name was Frances, and she was a perfectly reasonable person from a town in the flatlands who had decided that frontier life suited her romantic imagination considerably more than it suited her in practice. She lasted 5 days. She packed while he was checking his trap lines and was gone before he got back. She left a note that said the cabin was too dark and he was too silent, and she was sorry for wasting everyone's time. He found the note 3 days later. He hadn't noticed she was gone until Virgil came by asking what had happened. The second woman lasted 6 days, which felt like progress until she explained, through the door of the barn where she had apparently been sleeping since day 2, that she would rather take her chances on the road to Harlan Crossing than share another meal with a man who communicated primarily through the sounds he made while eating. "What sounds?" Rhett had asked. She had not answered that. She'd just kept walking. The third woman, her name was Clara, and she deserved better than she got, lasted 8 days, which was long enough for her to understand that the isolation wasn't going to lift. The silences weren't going to fill themselves, and the man who lived inside them had no particular interest in changing that. She wasn't unkind about leaving. She sat across from him at the table and said plainly, "I'm not what you need, and you're not what I need, and I think we both know it." And he had not been able to argue with her because she was right. Harlan Crossing had found the whole business tremendously entertaining. He heard about it in fragments. The jokes that circulated at the general store, the comments that stopped when he walked into the saloon. Someone had taken to calling him the groom nobody could stomach. Someone else suggested he hang a warning sign on the road up to his property. A man named Doyle Frick, who owned a dry goods operation on the main street and smiled with the particular pleasure of a person who had never experienced significant hardship, once said within Rhett's earshot that the mountain had better manners than its owner. Rhett had looked at him for a long enough moment that Frick had moved to the other side of his own counter, and the matter had been dropped. He didn't go to town often. He went when he had to. Supplies, trade, the occasional piece of business he couldn't conduct by any other means. When he went, he moved through quickly, spent as little time as possible in conversation, and returned to the mountain with the relief of a man stepping back into his natural element. The mountain asked nothing of him he wasn't already prepared to give. It didn't expect him to smile or explain himself, or fill silence with noise just because other people found silence uncomfortable. Down in the valley, people had expectations. They had notions about how a man should carry himself, what he owed to a conversation, what counted as warmth versus what counted as hostility. Rhett had long since stopped being able to make that distinction with any reliability. He knew he was rough. He knew his voice came out harder than he intended, that his patience for foolishness was shorter than other men's, that he had a way of looking at people that they found discouraging. He wasn't proud of it. He also wasn't sure he knew how to be different, and after 41 years, he'd stopped thinking about it with any regularity. The dog's name had been Cutter. He'd been the last of a bloodline Rhett had kept for 12 years, the last animal on the property, and his absence left the cabin quieter in a way that Rhett felt in his bones even before he'd consciously registered it. He went back inside, built the fire back up, and sat with his coffee going cold while the wind pushed at the walls. That was November. By December, Virgil had showed up again. Duh. "There's another one," Virgil said, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands and the particular expression of a man who expected to be told to leave. Rhett didn't look up from the harness he was mending. "Another what?" "The matchmaking service. They've got another woman. Widow, I think, or near enough. Looking for a frontier placement." "Tell them no." Virgil didn't leave. He came inside instead, which was either bravery or stupidity, and sat down in the chair by the fire without being invited. He'd been doing that for 15 years. It still annoyed Rhett every time. "The thing is," Virgil said, "folks have been asking about your land again." Rhett put the harness down. "Asking," he said. It wasn't a question. The word landed flat, in the way that most of Rhett's words landed. Virgil rubbed the back of his neck. "There's a company. Harlan Crossing Land Syndicate, they're calling themselves, though nobody around here has any idea who's actually behind it. Been approaching people all along the valley, offering to buy out properties, not quite threatening but not quite not, either. Silas Morrow sold last month, and 2 of the Pettit brothers." He paused. "They've been asking about your parcel specifically, the upper meadow, the creek access. Someone's told them it's the piece that ties everything together." "It is," Rhett said. "I know it is." "What does that have to do with another wife?" Virgil looked at him for a moment. "Man with a wife has a harder time being disappeared. That's all I'll say about it." Rhett picked the harness back up. He sat with that for a while, turning it over. Not the romantic logic of it, which he didn't believe in and didn't expect Virgil to be seriously offering, but the practical edge underneath. A man alone on a mountain was easier to pressure. A man alone on a mountain was easier to dismiss. He'd seen it happen to the Morrow family. Silas was a good man, but a solitary one. And when the syndicate's representatives had come to his door, there'd been nobody to talk strategy with, nobody to consult, nobody who would notice quickly enough if something went wrong. He wasn't afraid of much. He wasn't afraid of the syndicate either, in any immediate physical sense. But he understood terrain, and he understood that his particular terrain, a solitary man on an isolated property with no significant community ties, was not an advantageous one. "Send the information," he said. "I'll look at it." Virgil looked like he was trying not to show relief, which meant he'd been worried Rhett would say no, and he'd have to come back 3 more times. That was the thing about Virgil. He was persistent in the way water was persistent. He just kept coming back until he wore through. The letter arrived 2 weeks later, carried up from the Harlan Crossing post by a boy who'd been paid to make the trip and looked deeply unhappy about it, given the state of the road in mid-December. Rhett read it at the table with the fire going and Cutter's empty corner very present in his peripheral awareness. The letter was businesslike. The matchmaking service, a woman named Mrs. Elspeth Granger, ran the Harlan Crossing branch. She described the potential match in clear, undecorated language. Delilah Boone, age 34, widowed, originally of the Eastern Territories, currently residing in Harlan Crossing since the autumn past. Self-sufficient by disposition and necessity. Experience in domestic management, animal care, and limited medical practice. Understands frontier conditions. Has been advised of your situation and previous arrangements in full, and accepts this information without reservation. not a woman of conventional expectations. That last line sat in the air a moment. He read it again. Not a woman of conventional expectations. He didn't know what that meant. He decided, on balance, it probably meant something unflattering about one of them, and since the letter was presumably recommending the match, it was probably meant to be unflattering about him. Which was fine. He didn't have conventional expectations of himself either. He wrote back, 2 sentences. Send her up after the new year if the road allows. Tell her to bring practical clothing. What? She arrived on a Tuesday in late January. He knew she was coming that morning because the sky was the specific shade of pale gray that meant no precipitation for at least 24 hours. And he'd been watching the road with the intermittent, reluctant attention of a man who didn't want to appear to be watching the road. He was splitting wood when the wagon came around the lower bend, moving slowly on the icy track, driven by Hobe Kettrick, who ran the freight service out of Harlan Crossing, and who would have charged an extra rate for the mountain road in January, and been justified in doing so. He set the axe down and waited. The wagon stopped in front of the cabin. Hobe climbed down, his breath making clouds in the cold, and went around to the back. Rhett didn't move from where he was standing. What he saw first was the size of her, and he registered that fact with the same practical absence of judgment he brought to most things. She was a large woman, significantly so, built along lines that suggested she'd been solid her whole life and not apologetic about it. She was wearing a dark wool coat that had been mended at both elbows, and her boots were good, the kind made for actual outdoor use rather than appearance. Her hair was dark brown and had mostly escaped its pins, and her face, when she turned toward him after jumping down from the wagon, not waiting for Hobe to help her, just putting her hands on the sideboard and stepping down like it was nothing, was broad and plainly structured, with dark eyes that moved over the property in quick, methodical assessment. She looked at the woodpile. She looked at the cabin. She looked at the barn, and at the condition of the roof over the barn, and at the ice-rimmed water barrel near the east wall. Then she looked at him. "Rhett Calloway," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," he said. "Delilah Boone." "I know." She nodded once, as if confirming something she'd suspected. Then she turned back to help Hobe with her things, and Rhett stood there with his axe handle in his hand, unsure what had just happened, though it seemed like some kind of assessment had been conducted and some kind of determination had been made. He wasn't sure what the determination was, but she hadn't flinched, and she hadn't looked at the mountain with the expression, that wide, slow-dawning look of, "Oh, this is what it actually is," that had been the first signal with all 3 of the previous women. She had looked at everything the same way she'd looked at him, straight, quick, no particular alarm. Hobe helped her with 2 trunks and a large canvas bag and then stood around with his hat in his hands for a moment until Rhett paid him. Rhett did it without being asked, which seemed to surprise Hobe, though it shouldn't have. Rhett knew his manners. He simply deployed them selectively. When Hobe's wagon had gone back down the road, the silence settled. Delilah stood in front of the cabin with her trunks on either side of her and looked at the door. "You want to show me inside?" she said. Again, not a question, but not quite a command either. More like an observation about what would logically happen next. He showed her inside. The cabin was not large. One main room that served as kitchen and sitting area and everything else, a small sleeping room off the back, a storage section he'd added 3 years ago that was currently serving as an overflow pantry. The construction was sound. He'd been meticulous about the joints, the caulking, the way the weight bore, but it was not decorated in any meaningful sense. There was a table, 2 chairs, a 3rd chair that had lost a back rung, a shelf of practical items, a fireplace he'd rebuilt twice to get the draw right, and on the wall above the mantel, a hunting knife and a calendar from 1881 that he'd never taken down because he used the back of it to record his trapline numbers. She stood in the center of the main room and turned in a slow half circle. He waited for the comment. "Some version of it's smaller than I imagined, or it's very dark, or it could use something." She said, "The chimney draws well?" He blinked. "Yes. I can smell it from here. Good stonework." She walked to the window, which was covered with oilcloth rather than glass. "Is there glass available in Harlan Crossing?" "There's glass at Frick's. We'll want it for the north window at minimum before next winter. The oilcloth loses heat around the edges." She said this as if stating something obvious that should have been attended to already, which it should have been, and which he knew but had not gotten around to. She didn't say it with accusation, just as information. She moved to the fireplace. The mortar's cracking on the left side, there, above the second stone. That wants pointing before it opens up further. I know. I'm not criticizing, she said, turning around. I'm taking inventory. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them looked away. All right, he said. Where do you want the trunks? Back room. She went and retrieved the first trunk herself before he could do it, dragging it across the floor with the unself-conscious effort of someone accustomed to doing heavy things alone. He picked up the second one, which was heavier. It had the weight of tool, and carried it through. When he set it down, she was already arranging the first one against the wall. Mrs. Granger told you about the previous arrangements, he said. She did. You still came. I did. She stood up and rolled her shoulders back. She was maybe 5'4" and broad, and she stood like someone who'd learned that taking up space was not something to apologize for. 3 women, the longest lasting 8 days, the general impression being that you're difficult. That's accurate. What's the specific complaint from the women? He thought about it. Silence, the isolation, the manner. The manner meaning you're short with people. I'm told so. She nodded thoughtfully, like she was cataloging this alongside the chimney and the oilcloth. And the previous women. What were they expecting, do you think? He had never been asked this question. He sat with it for a moment, genuinely uncertain. I don't know, something different. Than what you are. Than what I am. She looked at him steadily. She had, he noticed, a very level gaze. It didn't shift around or look for something to land on. It just stayed where she put it. I was told the arrangement included land partnership, practical household sharing, and eventual formal marriage if both parties found the situation workable. That's correct. I wasn't told about love, she said. Mrs. Granger was very clear about that. She said you were not a sentimental man and that anyone expecting sentiment would be disappointed. He felt a muscle in his jaw tighten, not from the words themselves, they were fair, but from hearing them said out loud, in his own cabin, in the specific flat tone she was using. Also accurate. Good, she said. Then we understand each other. She looked around the back room once more. Where's the outhouse? East side, 30 feet. I'll need a key to the storage section. There isn't a lock. She looked at him again. Something that wasn't quite a smile crossed her face. A compression of the lips, brief and unreadable. All right, she said. I'll start the supper. She hadn't said what she meant to start, and when he came in from doing the evening chores, he found the cabin smelling of something that stopped him in the doorway. It wasn't elaborate. It was dried beans and cured pork, and something herbal that she'd found in her canvas bag. And she'd made a bread of some kind. Flat, pan-fried, the kind that worked without an oven. But the smell of it in the cold cabin was so different from the smell of his own cooking, which was mostly functional and sometimes burnt, that it landed differently than he expected. He sat down. She set the bowl in front of him without comment and sat down across from him with her own. They ate in silence. He'd expected her to try to fill it. That was what people did. What the previous women had done. What most people did when sitting across from a stranger in difficult circumstances. They filled the space. She didn't. She ate with the focused attention of someone who treated meals as a practical concern. And she didn't look at him in the searching way people looked when they were trying to read his silence as hostility. After a while, without looking up, she said, "The beans needed another hour. They're fine. They're a little firm. I underestimated the altitude." She tried another spoonful. "I'll know next time." He looked at her. She was still focused on her bowl. "Most people don't notice." "I notice," she said. He went back to his food. She said, "Is there a smokehouse?" "East of the barn. Working? Needs the door rehung." "I can do that." He looked at her again, this time letting it sit a moment longer. She glanced up and caught the look, and this time he could read the expression clearly. A mild, patient challenge. Not aggressive, not defensive, just a quiet refusal to be examined without looking back. "You've done it before," he said. "I've done most things before," she said. "Living alone will arrange that." He looked back at his bowl. After a moment he said, "How long were you widowed?" 2 years. What kind of man? She considered. A decent one, mostly. Weak chest. Couldn't manage the winters. She paused. He was a good deal better than advertised, and not quite as good as he believed, which is probably fair for most people. He made a short sound that might have been agreement. What about you? She said. Never married before this. I know that. I mean, what kind of man are you? He sat with the question for a long time, long enough that he thought she might rescind it, or decide she'd overstepped or fill the gap herself. She didn't. She waited with the same equanimity she'd brought to everything else, her spoon resting against her bowl, her eyes on him. A difficult one, he said, as established. That's what others say about you, she said. I'm asking what you'd say. He had no answer for that. He was used to defining himself by what he could do. Track, build, survive, not by what he was. The question sat in the room between them, and he left it sitting there because he had nothing to fill it with. She didn't press him. She finished her meal, cleared the bowls, and began the washing up with the efficient movements of someone who'd been doing it a long time in small spaces. He watched her for a moment, then went to build the fire up for the night. I'll take the back room, she said, if that's acceptable. It is. Is there a bar for the door? He looked at her. The question was practical, not accusatory. She was a woman in a strange man's house in the middle of the Blackstone Range in January, and she was asking a practical question. There's a hook and eye, he said. I'll put a bar on it tomorrow. She nodded once, satisfied. He went back to the fire. He could hear her moving around in the back room, arranging things, the specific sounds of a person making a space into a temporary home. It was strange to hear those sounds in the cabin. Not unpleasant. Strange. He didn't know what to do with that. The first real test came on the fourth morning. There'd been 3 days of the standard settling-in friction, the ordinary awkwardness of two people who didn't know each other, learning how the other moved through space, what rhythms they kept, what they needed for the day to work. He was up before light. She was up not long after. He made coffee with the kind of casual brutality he applied to most domestic tasks, and she made no comment about how he made it, but began, on the second morning, making it herself, which produced a result that was noticeably better, and which he drank without acknowledgement, which she didn't seem to expect. She'd begun making small adjustments to the cabin in the way she'd telegraphed she would. Nothing radical, nothing that required permission, just quiet, ongoing repairs of things that had been broken long enough to have become invisible. She found a cracked water bucket in the barn and fixed it with a leather patch and pine pitch. She rehung the smokehouse door as promised, working with his tools without asking to borrow them, because they were sitting in the barn and she needed them, and she was not a person who appeared to ask permission for reasonable things. She found the gap under the east wall where the cold was getting in and packed it with clay she'd dug from the creek bank. He watched all of this without comment. He didn't know what to say about it. He'd done some of these things himself, eventually, the bucketing, the wall gap, and hadn't done others because he'd run out of a particular material or day, and she had simply done them, not as performance, not to demonstrate anything, but in the way of someone who saw a problem and fixed it because the alternative was a problem. On the fourth morning, he came in from the trap lines early because one of the lines had been disturbed. Something had gotten into 3 of the sets, not a predator, or not quite, more like something that had been watching the line and had learned where the triggers were, which meant trouble he'd have to address, and found the cabin empty. He stood in the doorway for a moment, not alarmed, not yet, but alert. Her coat was gone. Her boots were gone. He went to the window and looked out toward the barn, and she wasn't there. He went around to the smokehouse. Nothing. He was about to go back inside for his own coat when he saw her coming up from the creek bed, carrying something large against her chest, moving carefully on the icy bank. He walked to meet her. She was carrying rocks, not carefully selected decorative rocks, but flat, dense creek stones, the kind with significant mass, 4 of them cradled in her coat front, which she was holding up like an apron to make a carrier. He looked at the rocks. He looked at her. Her face was red from the cold and she was breathing hard from the slope. "What are you doing?" he said. The north corner of the cabin floor, she said, not stopping. "The boards are soft there. Feels like the support underneath has shifted. If there's a frost heave working, you'll lose the corner by spring. These go under as shims until we can get proper lumber. He looked at the rocks again. They were good rocks for the purpose. Flat, dense, the right thickness. I would have done that, he said. She looked at him, still walking. When? He had no answer. I'm not arguing, she said. I'm asking so I know what to leave for you and what to just do. He fell in beside her, reached out, and took half the rocks out of her coat front without discussion. She let him. They walked back to the cabin together. Inside, she showed him the soft corner. She'd already lifted the board and assessed the problem, which was exactly what she'd said. A shifted support post settling away from the floor joists. He got down on his knees and looked. She was right. The rocks would work as a short-term solution. He handed them to her one at a time while she set them in place. When they stood up, she brushed the dirt off her knees. You're not what I was told, he said. She glanced at him sideways. What were you told? That you were kind-hearted. He said it the way he said most things, direct, without much inflection. That you'd be patient with a difficult situation. She made that same compressed, almost smile. And? The kind-hearted ones I've seen mostly don't pull their own weight. She looked at him for a moment. Her expression was difficult to read. There was something in it that had edges, something that didn't quite match the steadiness she wore the rest of the time. Is that what you've seen? She said. In my experience. She turned away toward the fire. After a moment, without looking at him, she said, I was kind-hearted before I was alone, Calloway. That was a luxury. After I was alone, I was practical first and kind-hearted when I had spare. She picked up the coffee pot. Those aren't the same thing. He didn't have an answer for that either. He was accumulating a list of questions she'd asked or statements she'd made that left him without responses, which was unusual. He was generally the one who left other people without responses. And he sat with that fact the way he sat with unfamiliar terrain, trying to map it without yet understanding the full shape of it. By the second week, Harlan Crossing had begun sending its opinions up the mountain. Virgil came by, always Virgil, on a Friday afternoon when the temperature had risen enough to make the road passable and the sky was doing what it occasionally did in winter and showing a cold blue slice of something that almost looked like hope. He came around the corner of the barn and found Delilah replacing the binding on one of Rhett's snowshoes, sitting on the upturned water barrel with the snowshoe across her knees and a look of focused concentration that she didn't adjust when Virgil appeared. Ma'am, he said, with the combination of surprise and recovery that characterized most people's first encounter with her doing something they hadn't expected. Virgil Pruitt. I run the Pruitt cattle operation east of here. Delilah Boone, she said, Calloway's present wife-to-be, if we don't kill each other first. She glanced up. He's in the barn. Virgil blinked. Then he laughed. The full, honest kind he did when something actually got him. Fair enough, he said, and went to find Rhett. Rhett was inside the barn working on a broken wagon trace when Virgil came in wearing the look of a man assembling a question he wasn't sure how to ask. She's different, Virgil said. Yes? From the others? Yes. Virgil put his back against the stall wall and folded his arms. Town's talking. Town always talks. They're saying she won't last. Doyle Frick's got a bet running. $2 says she'll be gone before February. He's giving odds. Virgil paused. Millie Cutler over at the dry goods annex says she feels sorry for the woman, which is the worst thing you can say about someone. Rhett set down the trace and looked at his neighbor. You came up here in January to tell me about Doyle Frick's betting pool. I came up here to tell you the syndicate sent a man to the Harlan Crossing recorder's office last week, asking about deed records, property history. They're mapping the upper range, Rhett. Virgil's voice had gone flat and careful, the way it went when he was delivering news he didn't enjoy delivering. Someone's drawing lines. The barn was quiet, except for the wind at the roof seams and one of Virgil's horses shifting in the cold outside. How many properties? Rhett said. 7 that I know of along the valley line. Maybe more on the far side of the Blackstone. Silas and the Pettit boys are gone. You know that. The Header family's holding, but the old man's sick and his sons are scared. He paused. They haven't approached me directly. I think they're leaving me for later, once they've got enough of the surrounding parcels to make me feel surrounded. They'll approach me. They will. Then I'll deal with it when they do. Virgil shook his head slowly. It's not that simple anymore. These aren't the usual land grabbers. This syndicate's got money behind it. Real money, the kind that pays for legal fees and political friendships. They're not going to ride up here with guns. He said the last word with a particular weariness. They're going to ride up here with paper, and that's harder to shoot. Rhett picked the wagon trace back up, turned it in his hands, set it down again. He was thinking, and he thought the way he did most things, without visible indication, without narrating the process. He was thinking about the deed to his property, which was in order, and the water rights, which were recorded, and whether either of those facts would matter against an operation with enough money to contest them through a court in a town where the judge might be sympathetic to certain economic interests. "The woman," Virgil said carefully. "Your Delilah. What's she like?" Rhett considered how to answer this. "Useful," he said. Virgil's eyebrows moved. "That's it?" "She notices things," Rhett said. Then, after a moment, as if the concession cost him something, "She's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" He thought about the word Mrs. Granger had used, kind-hearted. He thought about Delilah pulling rocks from the creek bed, about the flat look she'd given him when he said kind-heartedness was a luxury, about the 3 mornings in a row he'd come in from the cold to find the fire already built up, and coffee already made, and no expectation of thanks for either. "I don't know what I expected," he said. "Not her." Virgil nodded slowly, with the expression of a man filing something away. "She'll need friends down in town," he said. "My wife, Martha. You should bring her down sometime. Let the women get acquainted." "Delilah doesn't need me to arrange her acquaintances." "No," Virgil said. "Probably not." He pushed off the stall wall. "But bring her down anyway. The more people she knows, the more people know she's here." He let that sit for a moment. "That matters, Rhett. Given the current circumstances. That matters." He left the barn. Rhett stood in the cold for another minute, listening to Virgil's horse move off down the road, and then he put the wagon trace down for the second time and went to find Delilah. She was inside, at the table, with a piece of paper in front of her. She'd found it in her trunk. She had paper and ink and a small portable desk board that she used as a surface, and she was writing something in a careful, deliberate hand. He stood in the doorway. "The neighbor Pruitt," she said without looking up. "What kind of man?" "Good one," Rhett said, straight. He looked worried. Rhett came in and sat down. "He told you." "He told me something was happening with the land in the valley." Said it in the way men say things to women when they're trying to be informative without worrying them, which is a strategy that doesn't work on me. She looked up. "What's the syndicate?" He told her. He told her in the flat, methodical way he told things, without dramatic emphasis, just the facts as Virgil had presented them. The company, the approached properties, the departed families, the deed inquiries, the money behind it. He watched her while he talked. She listened the way she did everything. Straight on, fully present, not filling the gaps with nervous sounds or reassuring nods. When he'd finished, she looked down at her paper for a moment. Then she said, "How many settlers are still holding in the Upper Valley?" 12 homesteads, maybe 14 if you count the seasonal ones. "And how many of them know what's happening?" "Most," he said. "They talk." "Are they talking together or just each other?" He understood the distinction. "Each other," he said. "Separately." She wrote something. He couldn't read it from where he sat. She said, "They need to talk together." "People don't always—" "I know," she said. "People are proud and private, and they don't want to be seen as scared. I know." She looked up. "But the syndicate knows that. They're counting on it." She tapped the pen against the paper once. "Each family thinks they're making an individual decision about their individual property. That's the illusion. It's not individual. It's one move in a game that's already in progress, and the people on the losing side haven't realized they're playing yet." He looked at her. She was not a woman who was afraid of the thing she was looking at, and he'd noticed that consistently across every situation they'd encountered in 18 days. She looked at problems the way he looked at terrain, with the practical attention of someone deciding how to proceed, not with the flinching attention of someone deciding whether to run. "You should come to town," he said. She blinked, slightly surprised. "When?" "Soon. Virgil's wife is Martha. She knows everyone in the valley. If you want to understand what's happening, she's the person to talk to." Delilah looked at him for a moment. "You're suggesting I make friends in Harlan Crossing." "I'm suggesting you go to town with me." Another compression of her lips. something warmer in it this time. All right, she said. I'll need to make a supply list. Make the list, he said. He went back to the fire. Outside, the January wind was doing what January wind did in the Blackstone Range, finding every weakness, pressing into every gap, testing the structure of everything in its path. The structure held. Shut. They went to Harlan Crossing the following Wednesday in the wagon, on a road that had improved slightly, and then worsened again, and then improved enough to be passable with care. The town sat at the base of the foothills in the manner of most frontier towns, somewhat haphazardly, as if the buildings had arrived separately and parked wherever felt reasonable at the time, and now they all faced slightly different directions and held slightly different relationships to the main street, which was unpaved and currently frozen into a series of wagon track ridges that made the last quarter mile uncomfortable. Rhett drove. Delilah sat beside him, her coat buttoned to the throat, her eyes moving over the approach to town with the same assessment she'd given his cabin on the first day. He watched her watching it and thought, obscurely, that she was making a map. Not a physical one, a social one. She was reading the buildings and the relationships between them, the business names and their implications, the people on the street and the way they moved. They stopped in front of Frick's general store because they needed lamp oil, and Delilah had a list that included 3 other items he didn't recognize. He climbed down. She climbed down without waiting. They went inside. Doyle Frick was behind his counter with the particular alertness of a man who has heard something approaching and has arranged himself accordingly. He was around 50, with the soft hands of someone who handled money and goods rather than either directly, and a face that had learned over decades to communicate pleasantness while retaining a baseline of calculation. "Calloway," he said, and then his eyes moved to Delilah. He looked at her the way Rhett had seen people look at her in the 18 days of their acquaintance. A beat too long, a beat in the wrong direction, a small recalibration of expectation that people thought they were hiding. Delilah let him look. She didn't shrink from it or perform ease she didn't feel. She just let it happen and waited for it to be done. "This would be the new wife," Frick said. "Delilah Boone," she said. "Frick," he said. "Doyle Frick. I run this establishment." He gestured broadly at the establishment. "You'll find we carry most of what's needed for mountain living, and anything we don't have, we can order." "Do you carry rendered tallow?" she said. "Specifically sheep tallow, not beef." Frick blinked. "I carry beef tallow." "We'll take it then, but I'm going to need sheep eventually. Can you order it?" "I can make inquiries." "Please do." She turned to study the shelf of dry goods with the focused attention of a person doing a serious inventory. Frick looked at Rhett. Rhett looked back at him without expression. "She's," Frick started. "Thorough," Rhett said. They were in the store for 20 minutes. By the end of it, Delilah had assessed the store's inventory in significant detail, discovered a discrepancy in the weight of the flour sacks that she pointed out without accusation, simply as information, and had a brief, substantive conversation with Frick about the road conditions on the north side of the valley that yielded, if Rhett was reading it correctly, several pieces of useful intelligence about which properties the syndicate had approached, and in what order. Outside, loading the wagon, Rhett said, "You were asking him about the syndicate." "I was talking about roads," she said. "You were asking him about the syndicate." She looked up at him from her end of a crate. "Frick sells to everyone in this valley. He knows who's buying moving supplies and who's buying building supplies. That tells you a great deal about who's leaving and who's planning to stay." She set her end of the crate in the wagon bed. "He's not a bad man. He's a man who's trying to figure out which direction this is going to go so he can go with it." "And what did you determine?" She thought for a moment. "He's worried. The syndicate hasn't approached him yet, and that worries him more than if they had. A man who hasn't been approached doesn't know where he stands." She looked back down the street. "That means he's persuadable. And a persuadable man in that store is very useful." Rhett looked at her. She was reading the town the way he read a mountainside after a slide, looking at what had moved, what hadn't, where the weight was sitting. "Come," he said. "I'll take you to Virgil's wife." Martha Pruitt was a small, quick woman who'd been on the frontier long enough that she'd stopped being surprised by anything and had developed instead a calmly efficient way of dealing with whatever presented itself. When they came to her door, she looked at Delilah for about a second and a half and then stepped back to let them in. "Sit down," she said. Coffee's hot. The women talked. Rhett sat in the corner and let them, because it was not a conversation that required him. It was a conversation that required them, the two of them, and he was perceptive enough to recognize that and stay out of it. Martha knew things Virgil didn't know, the way women in frontier communities always knew things that circulated differently than the information men traded, because they moved through different spaces and were present for different conversations, and were underestimated in ways that made people speak freely around them. He caught fragments. The Heder family, 4 children, the father sick, the 2 older sons were scared, but the daughter, apparently, had told the syndicate representative to leave the property the last time he came and had backed it up with a shotgun. A family called Lester on the south side of the valley had been approached 3 times and had refused all 3 times, but their barn had burned 2 weeks ago, and nobody had said the word arson out loud. But everyone was thinking it. Martha's neighbor, a woman who ran a laundry out of her homestead, had heard from someone whose husband worked at the Harlan Crossing recorder's office that the property maps the syndicate had been reviewing went further up the range than the valley floor, went up into the Blackstone itself, into Rhett's land. He was not surprised by this. He had known, as Virgil had implied, that his property was the keystone, the creek access, the upper meadow, the particular geography of it that sat between the valley below and the high range above and controlled movement between both. But knowing something abstractly and hearing it confirmed in a warm kitchen while Delilah sat across from Martha Pruitt and listened with the focused stillness of a person assembling a picture, those were different things. After a while, Delilah said, "The families that are left, are they talking to each other?" "Some," Martha said. "Not enough." "No," Martha said. "Not enough." Delilah looked at her hands on the table. Then she looked at Martha. What would it take to get them in one room? Martha considered. A reason. A real one. The Lester barn. Maybe, if someone pointed to it directly. Someone needs to, Delilah said. Not pointing to it is how they win. Martha looked at her for a long moment, with the measuring look of a woman deciding whether another woman is serious or just sounding serious. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her. "I can get word to the Pruitt neighbors," she said, "and I know who talks to who on the south side." "That's a start," Delilah said. Rhett said nothing. He was watching Delilah, the way she held the table, the way she said "that's a start" instead of "that's good" or "that's enough," the way she was already seen past the current step to the ones that followed. The cabin repairs, the creek stones, the notebook she wrote in at the table sometimes when she thought he wasn't noticing. Not kind-hearted, she'd said. Practical first. He was beginning to understand the distinction she was drawing. They drove back up the mountain in the late afternoon with the cold coming down ahead of the darkness and the wagon wheels grinding on the frozen track. She sat beside him with her coat around her and her eyes on the road, and after a while she said without turning, "They don't believe I'll last." "No," he said. "Frick's got money on me leaving." He looked at her. "How did you know that?" "Martha Pruitt told me while you were looking out the window." A pause. $2, Martha said. "He's giving odds." The wagon moved. The cold was thorough and patient. "Are you going to?" he said. She turned her head and looked at him, and the look was level and unhurried and had something in it that he didn't have a word for yet. Some quality that sat between amusement and something harder than amusement. "Leave?" she said. "Yes." She turned back to the road. "No," she said. The mountain rose around them, dark and immovable, as it had always risen around everything that came to test itself against it. The wind moved through the pines. The last light was going out of the sky. He drove. She sat beside him. Neither of them said anything else, and the silence between them, for the first time, had a different quality than the silences that had come before. Not empty. Not uncomfortable. Something else that he was only beginning to learn the shape of. He didn't know what to call it yet, but he didn't want it to stop. The meeting happened on a Saturday, 3 weeks after that first trip to Harlan Crossing, in the Pruitt barn because it was the largest enclosed space within reasonable distance and because Virgil had the good sense not to call it a meeting. He called it a gathering. People came to gatherings. They dug in against meetings. 11 families showed up, which was more than Delilah had expected and fewer than she'd hoped for. They came in ones and twos over the course of an hour, parking wagons and tying horses with the particular self-consciousness of people who weren't sure they wanted to be seen doing what they were doing. Some of the men shook hands, some didn't. The women arranged themselves near the walls, and the children, of which there were several, were sent to the far end of the barn, where Virgil had put out a bucket of dried apples that occupied them with reasonable effectiveness. Rhett stood near the door with his arms crossed. He'd said on the drive down that he didn't intend to do much talking, and Delilah had said that was fine. She didn't need him to talk, she needed him present, which was a distinction he understood without requiring explanation. The man who spoke first was a broad-shouldered homesteader named Cal Heder, whose father was sick and whose sister had run the syndicate man off with a shotgun. He was somewhere in his late 20s with the look of someone who'd been carrying a weight that was slightly too heavy for slightly too long. He stood in the middle of the barn floor and said, without any particular ceremony, "I don't see what a meeting does that staying on our own land doesn't." Several people nodded. Delilah, who was standing beside Martha Pruitt against the left wall, said, "The Lester barn." The room went quiet in a specific way. Not the quiet of people who hadn't heard, but the quiet of people who'd been waiting for someone to say that out loud. Ed Lester was a lean, dry-voiced man in his 50s who stood with his hat held in both hands and said nothing. "Was it them?" Cal Heder said to Lester. Lester looked at the floor, then at the ceiling, then at his hat. "Can't prove it." "That's not what I asked." "No," Lester said, "can't prove it." "He's not asking what you can prove," Delilah said. She said it evenly, not unkindly, but without softening the point. "He's asking what you know." Lester looked at her. It was the look she'd been getting since she walked in. The look that went to her size first, and then tried to find its way to the rest of her, and sometimes made it and sometimes didn't. Lester's look made it. He was a man who'd lost a barn and was past the point of wasting attention on irrelevant things. "I know," he said, "that the syndicate man came to my property 4 times. I know the last time I turned him away, he said something about how isolated the Upper Valley was, how accidents happen in isolated places." He paused. "I know my barn burned a week later, and the fire started at the door, not inside, where it would have started if it was a lamp or a heater." The barn was very quiet. "That's what you know," Delilah said. "That's what I know." She looked around the room, at the faces, at the way people were standing, at the specific weight in the air. "The syndicate is counting on that," she said. "They can't prove it. Every family in this room has a can't prove it. Silas Morrow couldn't prove it when they told him the deed survey was disputed. The Pettit brothers couldn't prove it when the water on their east field got fouled. Can't prove it is the strategy. They don't need guns if they have enough can't prove it's. "So what do we do about it?" said a woman near the back. She was around 40, with the practical look of someone who ran a household and didn't have time for answers that weren't answers. "We stop acting like it's individual," Delilah said. "Every one of you is making a decision you think is about your own property. It isn't. It's one piece of something that was planned before any of you were approached." She paused. "What's the syndicate actually after?" Silence. Then Virgil said, "The water and the road access through the upper range." "Who controls the water and the road access?" Nobody answered immediately, but several people looked, with the involuntary directness of people who already knew the answer, at Rhett. Rhett, who had not moved from the door, said nothing. He was aware of being looked at, and he let it happen without acknowledgement, because acknowledgement would require a response, and he was still assembling what he thought. "Calloway's property," Cal Heder said. "The creek and the upper meadow. That's the piece that ties it." "Which means they need it," Delilah said. "Which means if Calloway holds, the rest of the puzzle doesn't complete. But they know that, and they know that isolating people works. So the answer is to not be isolated." "Pretty words," said a man near the back wall. A heavy-set homesteader named Gruber, whom Rhett recognized as someone who'd been in the valley 8 or 9 years and whose default relationship to other people's ideas was suspicion. "Pretty words don't put a new barn up for Lester. They don't unsell the Morrow property." "No," Delilah said. "They don't." She didn't argue the point. What does Lester need to rebuild? The question landed sideways because it wasn't rhetorical. She was asking for an actual answer. Lester blinked. "Timber," he said slowly. "About 40 board feet of good lumber, if I'm framing it right. and 3 days of men who know what they're doing. Delilah looked at the room. Who has timber they can spare? A pause. Then Virgil said, I've got some. Then Cal Header, I've got some green pine. Not ideal, but it'd serve. Then the woman near the back. My husband has milled boards from the fall. We were going to extend the chicken coop. Gruber, near the wall, said nothing. But he also, Delilah noticed, stopped looking suspicious and started looking at his boots. 3 days, Delilah said. That's what Lester said. You pull the timber and the hands, it gets done before the next weather, and the syndicate watches a barn go up instead of down. She let that sit. That's not pretty words. That's a barn. Nobody argued with a barn. The gathering lasted another hour, and it didn't resolve into anything formal. No committee, no declared alliance, nothing that could be called organized in a way the syndicate could read and counter. But when people left, they left differently than they'd arrived. They talked in small groups in the cold outside the barn. Lester shook hands with Virgil. The woman from the back, her name was Agnes, Delilah had gotten it from Martha, pressed a piece of paper with something written on it into Delilah's hand and said, in a low voice, My cousin married a man who works in the recorder's office in the county seat, not Harlan Crossing, the county seat. If you ever need a different set of eyes on a document, I can write to her. Delilah folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Agnes said, and walked to her wagon. On the drive home, the road was dark, and the cold was serious, and Rhett drove with the focused attention the road required at night in February. After a while, he said, You planned that. The gathering? The barn. Delilah was quiet for a moment. The barn was real. Lester needs it. I know he needs it. I mean, you plan to use it as the first thing, the concrete thing. She didn't deny it. People can argue about strategy forever. They can't argue with a barn. He drove. The pines moved in the wind on either side. You were a school teacher, he said. It wasn't something she'd told him directly, but he'd assembled it from fragments, the way she said things, the way she waited out a room. For a while, she said, before I was married, and after, some. You know how to move a room. I know how to listen to a room, she said. It's not the same thing. The barn went up in 4 days, not 3, because the weather on the second day was too poor to work safely in, and because 3 of the men who came had different ideas about the frame structure and spent the better part of a morning disagreeing about it before Cal Header got tired of listening and just started putting up the one he thought was right, at which point the argument became academic and everyone helped. Delilah was there all 4 days. She couldn't do the heavy framing work, and she didn't pretend to. She brought food both times it was needed, she helped sort and carry lumber, and she spent significant time with the women who came with their husbands, the quiet, persistent work of being present and useful and interested in what other people had to say. She learned that Agnes's cousin was in fact a clerk in the county property office and had access to documents the Harlan Crossing recorder might not. She learned that one of the Header boys had seen a man he didn't recognize surveying the upper meadow line from the tree line 2 weeks ago. She learned that the Gruber family, whose patriarch had said nothing at the gathering, had been approached by the syndicate twice, and that what had silenced Gruber was not stubbornness, but fear. A specific, quiet, domestic fear that the syndicate representative had said something to his wife when Gruber wasn't home, something she hadn't fully told her husband yet. She didn't push on that, she filed it. Rhett came the last 2 days. He worked without being asked, the way he did most things, and he was good at it. He understood timber and load and how to make a joint that would hold through the mountain winters. And Cal Header watched him work for about 20 minutes on the second day, and then started asking him questions about the roof pitch, which Rhett answered in his flat, direct way that apparently Cal found useful because the questions kept coming. It was, Delilah observed, the closest thing to easy conversation she'd seen Rhett sustain with another man. On the drive home after the last day, with the finished barn behind them and the cold coming fast, she said, You and Header. What about it? You're the same kind of man. He thought about that. He talks more. Not by much. She pulled her coat closer. He trusts you. He was watching you work and deciding something. People decide things, Rhett said. Not that kind of thing that fast, she said. Cal Header's going to be important. Rhett didn't argue. He'd come to the point of not arguing with her observations. Not because he always agreed with them, but because they had a consistent record of being accurate, and arguing accurate things was something he'd never seen the point in. A week after the barn was finished, the syndicate made its first direct move against Rhett's property. It came in the form of a letter, delivered not through the Harlan crossing post, but by a man on a horse who rode up to the cabin on a cold morning and handed it over without any particular ceremony and left again without waiting for a response, which told Rhett something about the confidence of the people who'd sent it. He read it at the table. Delilah sat across from him. The letter was from a legal firm in the county seat, a firm called Haldern and Associates, acting on behalf of a company called the Blackstone Development Concern. It stated in the elaborate language of legal correspondence that there was a question regarding the original survey of Rhett's eastern property line, specifically the section that included the Upper Meadow Creek access, and that the Blackstone Development Concern had commissioned a new survey that suggested the creek access might fall within a disputed boundary. It invited Rhett to engage with their legal representatives at his earliest convenience to discuss the matter. He put the letter down. Delilah picked it up. She read it carefully, then read it again, which told him there was something in it worth reading twice. Then she set it down and looked at him. "They don't actually believe the survey is disputed," she said. "No. This is the paper," she said, echoing something Virgil had said months ago, and Rhett recognized that she'd remembered it exactly. "This is what they do before the harder things." "Yes," she thought for a moment, tapping the letter's edge against the table. "Agnes's cousin. The recorder. The county seat recorder. The original deed survey would have been filed there. If we can get a copy, a certified copy, before they do anything with the boundary claim, it becomes harder to contest." She paused. "Do you have your deed?" "Yes." "Can I see it?" "See?" He got it from the storage section, from the box where he kept the papers that mattered, and brought it to the table. She spread it out and studied it with the focused attention she brought to things she was taking seriously. After a while she said, "The survey date is here. And the surveyor's name. Aldous Penny. He's dead. But his records aren't necessarily." She folded the letter and set it beside the deed. "We need to write to Agnes today." He looked at her. "We." She met his eyes. "Unless you'd rather I write and you sign, or you write and I advise, or we pretend it's not both of us doing this." He said nothing. "Calloway," she said, "this is your land. I'm not trying to take over your land." "I know that." "Then what?" He sat with it for a moment, trying to locate the specific friction. It wasn't the collaboration he objected to. He'd already accepted, without formally acknowledging it, that she was better at certain kinds of thinking than he was. It wasn't the suggestion itself. It was something more particular and harder to name, something about the word we sitting in his cabin, at his table, next to his deed, with a naturalness that hadn't existed 30 days ago and that he didn't know how to hold yet. "Write to Agnes," he said. She wrote the letter that evening at the table while he sat by the fire and did not pretend he wasn't aware of the scratch of the pen. She wrote 2 drafts. He could tell by the pause between the first and second, the brief silence of someone reconsidering an approach. The final version she read aloud to him before sealing it, which was not something he'd asked her to do, but which he understood as the gesture it was. "Any changes?" she said when she'd finished. "No," he said. She folded it and addressed the envelope. He watched her do it. He was doing that more often, watching her do things. Not because he was suspicious or even particularly curious, but because there was something about the way she moved through tasks, the economy of it, the absence of wasted motion that he found himself paying attention to in the way he paid attention to things he was still learning. The response from Agnes's cousin came in 10 days. It contained a certified copy of the original survey, dated clearly, with the boundary line well established and the creek access documented without ambiguity. It also contained a handwritten note from the cousin that said the Blackstone Development Concern had requested access to the same records 4 days ago and had been told the records were in use. Delilah read the note twice. Then she looked up with an expression Rhett had not seen on her before. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but something cooler and more focused. A hunter's expression. Almost. The particular look of a person who has just confirmed something they suspected and is already thinking about what it means. "They were going to contest the records," she said. Looks like someone was going to make those documents difficult to find. She set the note down. We got there first. Agnes's cousin took a risk. She did. Delilah folded the certified copy carefully and put it in the box with his deed. We'll need to remember that. He watched her put the copy away, watched her close the box and set it back on the shelf. She stood there for a moment with her back to him, and he thought she was about to say something else, something about the next step, the next strategy. Instead, she turned around and her face had changed slightly. The hunter's look was gone. She looked tired in a way she rarely let show. Are you all right? He said. She looked at him, clearly a little surprised at the question. Yes, she said. You look tired. I am a little. She came back to the table and sat down. I'm not used to worrying about other people's barns, she said. I'm used to worrying about my own. He looked at her. He thought about Francis, who had packed in the night, and Clara, who had said plainly, this isn't what I need. He thought about the empty corner where Cutter used to sleep and the way the cabin had sounded before January. He thought about 2 months ago and how it compared to sitting in this kitchen, at this table, with a certified property survey in the box, and a letter from a county clerk and a woman across from him who had, in 58 days, fixed more broken things than he'd fixed in 2 years. The Lester barn, he said. She looked up. I'll go back and fix the north joint, he said. They put it up too fast and it'll shift in the spring thaw. She studied him for a moment. That's kind, she said. It's practical, he said. If the barn fails, they'll blame the timber and nobody will donate timber for the next one. She looked at him steadily, and the compressed, almost smile came back, except this time it was slower and warmer and somewhat less compressed. All right, she said, Rachel, practical. He went back to the fire. She sat at the table for a while longer, and he could feel her presence there, the specific weight of it in the room, the same way he could feel a change in the weather coming through the walls before the sky showed it. He had stopped being surprised by that feeling. He had not yet decided what to do with it, but he had stopped being surprised. Outside, the February wind had finally begun to carry something different in its lower register. Something that wasn't quite warmth, but was the memory of warmth, the distant promise of a season turning. The Blackstone Range didn't soften easily, and it didn't soften fast, but it did, eventually, soften. He had been on this mountain long enough to know that. The supply wagons stopped coming on a Thursday. Rhett knew something was wrong before he could name it specifically. The same way he knew weather, through accumulation of small signals that didn't individually mean anything but together formed a pattern. Hobe Kettrick's freight run was 3 days late. The header boy who sometimes carried messages along the Upper Valley Road hadn't come through in a week. And the morning Rhett rode down to the junction where the Valley Road met the mountain track, he found the junction empty in a way that felt deliberate rather than incidental. He rode back up and told Delilah. She was at the table with her notebook, which had become, over the course of 3 months, something considerably more than a notebook. It was a record of conversations and observations and names and connections, written in her careful hand, and he'd stopped pretending he wasn't aware of it. She looked up when he came in. How late? She said. Hobe's run should have been Tuesday. She closed the notebook. The South Road? I don't know yet. She stood up and got her coat. They rode together to the Pruitt property, and Virgil met them at the gate with the particular expression of a man who had been waiting for someone to arrive so he could stop being the only person who knew something bad. He told them what he knew in the straightforward way he told things. The syndicate's hired men had been seen on the Valley Road 2 nights ago, enough of them to constitute a significant number. And the following morning, Kettrick's freight depot in Harlan Crossing had been found with its south side doors damaged, and 2 of the 3 ready wagons with cut wheel spokes. Kettrick himself was unharmed, but was not, as of yesterday, willing to run the mountain route. He's scared, Virgil said. Can't blame him. No, Delilah said. Has anyone gotten through from the south in the last 2 days? One man on horseback. Name of Ferris. He does odd work for the headers. He said the road through the lower valley is clear, but the branch that goes up to the Gruber and Lester properties had men on it yesterday morning, not blocking it exactly, just present. Just present, Delilah repeated. Standing around, Virgil said, looking at people. Rhett said, what about the families up the north side? The Calder claim, the Winslow homestead. That's the problem, Virgil said. He looked at Delilah, then back at Rhett. The storm that came through Monday pushed a lot of snow down the north track. Calder's got 6 people on that property, 2 of them children, and their pantry was low. I know because Martha talked to Calder's wife not 2 weeks ago, and she said they were expecting Kettrick's run to resupply before the heavy weather. He rubbed his jaw. They've been cut off since Monday. That's 4 days. The Winslow family? Delilah said. 3 adults they'll manage, but the Calder situation is what worries me. Rhett was already thinking about the North Track. He knew it better than anyone on the valley floor, better probably than anyone except possibly old Magnus Winslow, who'd been on his claim for 20 years. The North Track in heavy snow was not a route. It was an idea about a route. After a significant snowfall, it closed down to the kind of passage that required specific knowledge and specific nerve and a willingness to be wrong and have that wrongness cost you considerably. There's another way, he said. Delilah looked at him. The old mining cuts, he said, from the Blackstone silver operation 15 years ago. They ran tunnels through the North Ridge to move ore without using the valley road. Some of the surface cuts are still open, if you know where they are. Do you know where they are? Delilah said. Most of them? Most. Enough. She held his look for a moment. Then she said, how many people could you move through them? On foot, with supplies. Maybe a dozen at a time. It's not a wagon route. It's a walking route, single file in places. He paused. The Calder property is accessible from the East Cut if you come around the second ridge. It adds 2 miles, but it avoids the blocked track entirely. Virgil said, in this weather. It's passable, Rhett said. I came through the East Cut and worse. You, Virgil said carefully. Not 6 people, 2 of them children, carrying supplies. No, Rhett said, not alone. The word alone sat in the cold air of Virgil's yard and meant something different than it would have meant 4 months ago. Rhett was aware of that, and so, he could tell, was Virgil. Delilah had been thinking while they spoke. He could tell by the quality of her stillness. She went very still when she was moving pieces around, a stillness different from her ordinary calm, tighter, more directed. She said, the Calder family isn't the only one. If the supply routes are cut and the weather is this bad, there are other families short on provisions. We need to know who. Martha can find that out faster than anyone, Virgil said. Then she should start now, today. Delilah turned to Rhett. If we go through the mining cuts, we can resupply the Calder family and get them down to the Winslow claim where there's more people and more warmth. Then we coordinate a larger supply run once we know who else is in trouble. She paused. But we need to move soon. If another storm comes, there's 1 building, Rhett said. I saw it this morning in the cloud pattern. 2 days? Maybe 3. Delilah looked at him steadily. Then we go tomorrow. Virgil said, I can send 2 of my men. I need men who can move in deep snow, Rhett said. Not just willing, capable. Tom Airy, Virgil said, without hesitation. And Cal Heder, if he'll come. He'll come, Delilah said. She'd assessed Cal Heder at the barn raising and had not revised her assessment since. Ask him today. They left before light the next morning, 5 of them, Rhett, Delilah, Tom Airy, Cal Heder, and Agnes's husband, a quiet man named Pete, who hadn't been asked but had appeared at the Pruitt property that evening, with his own pack and the look of someone who'd already had the necessary conversation with his wife and wasn't going to have it again. They carried food, medicine, 2 extra blankets apiece, and rope. Delilah had packed the medical supplies herself, from her own stores, things she'd been building quietly since January, trading for them in Harlan Crossing on the 2nd and 3rd visits with a specificity that had puzzled Rhett at the time. Willow bark, clean cloth, a bottle of carbolic, a small surgical kit that had belonged to her husband. He'd watched her pack them the night before without comment, and she'd packed them without explaining, and neither of them had found this arrangement strange. The East Cut began 300 yards above the Pruitt tree line, behind a granite outcrop that looked from below like a solid wall. Rhett found the entrance in the dark, the way he found most things in the dark, by knowing where it was and walking toward it. The cut opened into a passage roughly 8 feet wide and 6 feet high, carved by men who'd been moving ore carts and had needed functional dimensions. The floor was uneven and ice-rimmed in places, and the first 100 yards required careful footing, but it was out of the wind, and after the cold of the open slope, That absence felt almost warm. Cal Heder put his hand on the tunnel wall and said, "How far does this go?" "Half a mile through the ridge," Rhett said. "Then it opens on the north side. From there it's another mile and a half to the Calder property." "In the snow." "In the snow." Cal took his hand off the wall. "All right," he said, and kept walking. The passage through the tunnel took 20 minutes. On the north side, the landscape was different. The storm that had come through Monday had left deeper accumulation here, sheltered from the wind by the ridge, in a way that meant the snow had piled rather than drifted. And in places it was thigh-deep on Rhett, and worse on Delilah, who was shorter and was moving through it with the grim, methodical effort of someone who had made a decision and was executing it regardless of what the terrain thought about that. He stayed close to her without making a production of it. Twice he reached back a hand when the footing was uncertain, and she took it without comment, and he didn't treat it as anything other than what it was: two people moving through difficult ground. They reached the Calder property in just under 2 hours. The cabin had the specific look of a place that had been shut tight against the cold for days. Every gap stuffed, the chimney working hard, no movement outside. When Rhett knocked, there was a long pause before the door opened, and the face that appeared was Nora Calder, 40-something, with the eyes of a woman who had been holding things together through the force of not having any alternative. She looked at the 5 of them on her porch. She looked at the packs they were carrying. She said nothing for a moment. "Mrs. Calder," Delilah said, "we've brought supplies. How is everyone?" Nora Calder's face did something complicated that she visibly controlled before it got away from her. "Come in," she said. "Please." Inside it was warm but close. 6 people in a cabin not built for 6 people in extended confinement. The 2 children were at the table, older than Rhett had pictured from Virgil's description, maybe 8 and 11, both watching the arrivals with the wide-eyed attention of people for whom something happening was itself notable. Nora's husband, a man named Clark, who'd injured his leg in a fall the previous autumn and was still not right with it, was sitting by the fire with his leg extended and an expression of relief he was trying to cover with dignity. "The leg," Delilah said, setting down her pack and moving toward him directly. "May I look at it?" Clark Calder glanced at his wife. Nora gave a small nod. He pulled up his trouser leg. Rhett looked away and let Delilah work. He could hear her asking Clark questions in the focused, clinical way she asked questions when she was gathering information she needed. When did it start swelling again? Was there heat in the joint? Had he been able to bear weight? Clark answered in the short, slightly embarrassed way men answered medical questions, and Delilah received the answers without reaction and kept going. Cal and Tom and Pete were unpacking the food supplies. And the 2 Calder children had discovered that Pete had put a paper packet of dried apricots near the top of his pack and were looking at it with a longing they were being very polite about. Pete handed it over without being asked. Rhett said to Clark, "Can you walk on it?" "Some," Clark said. "Not far." "We're going to bring you down to the Winslow claim," Rhett said. "More people, better positioned. When the road clears, you can come back." Clark looked at him. A proud man, Rhett could see. The kind of man who'd built his own cabin and didn't like the idea of being carried out of it. "The stock," Clark said. "I've got 2 mules and a milk cow." "Where are they?" "Barn." "We'll bring them. Winslow's got pasture." Rhett said this as if it were already settled, because treating things as settled was sometimes more useful than asking for agreement. Clark looked at him for another moment, doing the calculation, and then he nodded. They stayed 2 hours. Delilah wrapped Clark's leg in a way that would let him walk shorter distances without worsening it, and she left Nora the carbolic and clean cloth with brief, clear instructions. She drank the coffee Nora made because refusing would have meant something, and she ate nothing of the family's food despite Nora's offering, which Rhett noticed and which Nora also noticed, because Nora looked at Delilah afterward with an expression that had something in it beyond ordinary gratitude. The walk to Winslow's took another 90 minutes, slower because of Clark and the animals and the children, who were game but young. Magnus Winslow was 73 years old and had a face like weathered granite, and a cabin large enough that the Calder family's arrival constituted an inconvenience he accepted without visible complaint, which, from what Rhett knew of Magnus, constituted warmth. They made it back through the mining cut to the south side of the ridge by mid-afternoon, just as the sky was beginning to do what Rhett had read it doing that morning. The storm was coming in faster than 2 days. He said so on the walk back down to the Pruitt property, where they'd agreed to regroup. Delilah was beside him, moving with the deliberate pace of someone whose legs were tired but who wasn't going to mention it. She'd been walking in deep snow for 6 hours. Her coat was soaked through from the waist down where she'd post-holed through a drift, and she hadn't said anything about it. "How fast?" she said. "Tonight, maybe. Tomorrow morning, at the latest. Then we need to know about the other families today." She said this without the inflection of someone complaining about the timeline, just someone noting a constraint. "When we get to Virgil's, has Martha had time?" "She's had all day," Rhett said. Martha had had all day, and Martha, as Rhett had come to understand, used time well. She'd sent messages by 3 different routes and had received information back from 2 of them. When they arrived at the Pruitt house, the kitchen table had a rough map of the Upper Valley on it with pencil marks at 7 locations, and Martha was standing over it with the focused authority of someone who had been waiting to give a report. 4 families were in potential supply trouble. 2 of those were manageable. They had enough to last another week, and if the supply routes reopened within that time, they'd be fine. The other 2 were not manageable. The Fenner family on the North Road's far branch and an older couple named Brecht, who lived at the highest elevation of any homestead in the valley. They were both short on food and, in the Brecht situation, also short on firewood because old Hector Brecht had been relying on a supply delivery that hadn't come. "The Brechts are at 4,000 feet, Rhett said. "I know," Delilah said. "If the storm hits tonight—" "I know," she said again. She was studying the map. "The mining cuts. Is there a route to the Brecht elevation?" He looked at the map. "There's a west cut, shorter through the ridge, but it comes out steep on the other side. It's not the East Passage." "Meaning?" "Meaning it's harder, exposed on the exit. If the weather turns while you're on the west face—" "We go now," she said, "before it turns." He looked at her. She was exhausted. He could see it, the particular quality her face had when she was running on the reserve beneath the reserve, the place she went when the ordinary reserves were spent. He'd learned to read it over 3 months of close quarters, the same way he'd learned the mountain's own tells. "I'll go," he said. "With Cal, if he'll do another run." "I'm going," she said. "You've been in the snow for 6 hours. And the Brechts have been without firewood in a mountain winter, and I know what medicinal stores I'm carrying and what the old man might need, and you don't." She said it without heat, just the plain arrangement of facts. "I'm going." Cal Heder, who had been standing near the door eating a piece of bread Martha had pushed at him, said, without looking up, "I'll go." Tom Airy said, "Same." Pete in the corner just stood up and started repacking his bag. Delilah looked at all of them. Something crossed her face. Not sentimentality, nothing as simple as that, but something genuine and briefly unguarded. Then she looked back at the map and started talking logistics. They went out again into the failing afternoon light, the 5 of them plus Virgil himself this time, who had come with the look of a man who'd run out of reasons to stay behind. The west cut was where Rhett had said it was, and harder than the east by a measure that became clear once they were through the ridge and facing the exit slope. The exit was a 40-degree pitch of crusted snow that had refrozen after the Monday storm, hard on top and uncertain underneath. Below it, the terrain ran out into a wide bowl that was safer, but getting down the pitch was the problem. Rhett went first, testing, finding the places where the crust held and the places where it didn't, moving with the deliberate caution of someone who respected the mountain without being afraid of it. Behind him, Delilah came down in the same way she'd done everything from the first day. Without ceremony, with complete attention to what was in front of her. She slipped once on the lower section, caught herself on one knee, got back up. Her trouser knee was dark with snow, and she kept moving. The Brecht cabin was a low, sturdy structure that looked like it had grown out of the hillside rather than been built on it. When they knocked, it took a long time for the door to open, and when it did, the smell of cold inside was alarming. Not as cold as outside, but close, far closer than a cabin with an active fire should have been. Hector Brecht was in his late 70s, thin in the way old men got thin when they'd been rationing food, and his wife Edna was sitting in the chair closest to the fireplace, wrapped in every blanket they owned. And when Delilah crossed to her and took her hands, Edna Brecht's hands were cold in a way that was not right. "How long has she been like this?" Delilah said to Hector, keeping her voice even. "Since yesterday," Hector said. He was steady. The old man. steady in the way of people who've survived enough that panic had simply worn out of them. She said she was cold, and then she stopped saying much. Cal and Tom were already bringing in wood from the pile they'd carried up the slope, and Pete was working the dead fire back to life with the focused urgency the situation warranted. Virgil stood near Hector with his hand on the old man's shoulder, saying something quiet. Delilah stayed with Edna. She worked without asking for help, except when she needed specific things, and when she asked directly. More blankets, hot water when the fire was sufficient, the specific bottle from the left pocket of her pack. Rhett got these things and brought them to her, and she used them without looking up. After 40 minutes, the fire was serious, the cabin was warming, and Edna Brecht had started talking again, slowly, disoriented, but talking. Delilah sat back on her heels and let out a breath that was not quite steady. Rhett crouched beside her, close enough that only she could hear. "She'll be all right? She needs warmth and food, and to not be left alone tonight," Delilah said. She was looking at Edna. "She got very cold. Someone should stay." "Yes." A pause. "Virgil will stay. He'll do it if I ask him." "He'll do it if I ask him too." She glanced at him sideways. "I know," she said, "but it's better if I ask." He sat with that. She was right. Virgil would do it for either of them, but the shape of the ask mattered, and she knew which shape fit the moment. He had stopped being surprised that she knew these things. He had moved into the territory of relying on her knowing them, which was a different thing, and further in. Outside, the first wind of the coming storm was beginning to find the west face, pushing against the cabin walls with the preliminary pressure of something that meant to be serious. Rhett could hear the pitch of it changing, the low register that meant the storm was not 2 days out, not 1 day out, but tonight, and committed. He looked at Delilah. She was already looking at him. "We need to go," she said. "Now." Yes, they told Virgil. He accepted it with the equanimity of a man who'd farmed the Blackstone foothills for 20 years and understood what the mountain was when it was serious. They left him with enough food for 2 days, the extra blankets, and Delilah's instructions for Edna written on a piece of paper in her careful hand. Then they went back out into the dark and the rising wind, back across the bowl, back up the 40-degree pitch, which was worse going up than going down, and slower. And by the time they reached the top, Rhett's legs were burning, and beside him Delilah was breathing in the deep, controlled way of someone managing exertion rather than being managed by it. Through the tunnel, down the south side. The snow was coming by the time they reached the lower tree line. Not the full storm yet, but the leading edge, small, hard flakes that came sideways on the wind and meant business. They made the Pruitt property in the dark, barely. Martha came out with a lamp and didn't say anything about the state of them, just held the door open and pointed at the fire. Rhett sat down in Virgil's chair by the hearth and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that his hands were shaking. Not from cold, exactly. From the accumulated expenditure of the day, from the specific cost of the west face and the Brecht cabin and Edna's cold hands, and the storm coming in against their backs the whole way down. Delilah sat on the bench near the fire, pulled off her boots, and held her feet toward the heat in the frank, unself-conscious way of someone past caring about appearances. Martha brought food. Delilah ate it. Rhett ate his. After a while, the shaking in his hands stopped. Cal Heder, eating soup across the table, said, without looking up, "What's the plan if the storm blocks the cuts tomorrow?" The room was quiet except for the fire. Delilah said, "We find another way." Cal looked up. He looked at her for a moment. The same look he'd given Rhett at the Lester barn. The look of a man deciding something. Whatever he decided, it settled him. He went back to his soup. Outside, the storm committed itself to the mountain, and the mountain held, the way it always had, indifferent and immovable, and asking, as it always did, whether the people on it were equal to what it cost to be there. Delilah sat by the fire with her feet extended and her coat drying on the hook and her hands wrapped around a bowl of soup, and she did not look like a woman who was about to answer that question with anything other than yes. The storm lasted 3 days. When it broke, the Blackstone Range looked like something that had never been touched by human hands. White in every direction, the tree line buried to the lower branches, the roads invisible beneath 4 feet of accumulation that had drifted in places to twice that. The sky came out hard and blue and indifferent, the way it always did after a serious storm, as if it had no memory of what it had just done. Rhett was outside at first light, assessing. The east cut would be passable. He knew its geometry well enough to know that the ridge above it would have channeled most of the snow away from the entrance. The west cut was another question. He didn't know yet, and not knowing bothered him in the particular way that gaps in necessary information always bothered him. Delilah came out while he was looking at the drifts along the north face of the cabin. She had coffee, 2 cups, and she handed him one without comment. They stood in the cold and drank it and looked at the mountain together. "Virgil?" she said. "He'll have stayed put. He's got sense." The Brechts. "Edna was already improving when we left. 3 days of fire and food." He paused. "She'll be all right." Delilah drank her coffee. After a moment, she said, "The syndicate won't have been idle." "No. 3 days of storm means 3 days of nobody watching what they do." He'd been thinking the same thing since the storm broke. The syndicate had cut the supply routes deliberately. Before a storm they would have known was coming. Weather on the Blackstone was readable if you knew how to read it, and the syndicate had enough money to employ people who knew how. The timing hadn't been accidental. The blocked routes plus the storm had been designed to put pressure on the most vulnerable families in the Upper Valley, the ones with the least margin, the ones most likely to sign whatever paper appeared in front of them when they were cold and hungry and frightened enough. What the syndicate hadn't anticipated was the mining cuts. And Delilah. "They'll come with papers now," she said. "They'll go to the families who've been struggling and offer to buy. Generous terms, they'll say. Once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "The Fenners, the Hedder family. Anyone who got scared enough during the storm. Cal won't sell." "No, but his mother might want him to. And a man who loves his mother is a man who can be moved in ways he doesn't see coming." She looked at him. "We need to get the certified survey copy to the county marshal's office. Not the Harlan Crossing office, the county seat. That's 60 miles. I know how far it is." He looked at her. "There's more than the survey." "Agnes's cousin," she said. "The document requests the syndicate filed. If they requested access to property records that they then intended to contest or alter, that's a criminal matter," Rhett said. "If you can prove intent, which is why we need someone at the county seat who isn't connected to Harlan Crossing." She had been thinking through this, he could tell, for longer than this morning. Possibly for days. "There's a territorial marshal named Voss. Martha mentioned him when we were talking about the Lester barn. She said he'd investigated a land fraud case 2 valleys east 3 years ago. He knows what this kind of operation looks like." "You want to go to the county seat?" "I want to send the right information to the right person," she said. "Going isn't necessary if the information gets there reliably." She paused. "But someone has to carry it who won't be stopped on the road." He thought about that. The syndicate's men had been on the Valley Road. They'd damaged Kettrick's freight operation. They were not at this point people who were limiting themselves to legal pressure and intimidating letters. "I'll go," he said. She looked at him. "You're the property they want most. Which makes me the person they'd least expect to leave it." She held his look for a moment. Then, "Take Cal." "Cal has his own property." "Cal will go," she said. "He decided something at Martha's table the other night. I don't know exactly what, but it pointed toward this." She finished her coffee. "I'll prepare the documents. Everything. The certified survey, Agnes's cousin's letter, the boundary claim from Haldern and Associates, the timeline of what's happened to each family. Written out clearly, so Voss can follow it without needing us to explain it in person. I'll have it ready by tonight." He didn't argue. He went to find Cal Hedder. Cal was already digging out his property when Rhett arrived, working with the focused efficiency of a man who knew the job and had started it without needing to be told. He looked up when he saw Rhett coming and read something in the way Rhett was moving across the snow because he set his shovel against the fence post and waited, Rhett explained. Cal listened the way he listened to things, straight on, without interrupting, without the preliminary objections that some men offered while they were still processing what they were being told. When Rhett finished, Cal said, 60 miles. 60 miles. Road's going to be rough after this. Yes. Cal looked at his property, the cabin, the barn that the community had built, the fence line he'd been digging out. He looked at it in the specific way of a man calculating what he was leaving behind versus what he was going toward. Then he said, "We leave at first light tomorrow?" First light, Rhett said. I'll tell my mother, Cal said, and picked up his shovel. Tieta. Delilah worked through that night. Rhett woke at 2 in the morning, and she wasn't in the back room, and the light under the door meant the lamp in the main room was still burning. He lay in the dark and listened to the scratch of her pen and the occasional movement of paper, and after a while he got up and put more wood on the fire without being asked, without saying anything, and went back to bed. The pen kept moving. By morning there was a packet on the table, sealed with wax and wrapped in oilcloth against the weather, with a folded letter on top addressed in her careful hand to Territorial Marshal E. Voss, County Seat Office. She handed it to him over the coffee cups. Everything's in there, she said. The survey, the letters, the timeline of properties approached, and the outcomes. Agnes's cousin's name is on the 3rd page as a witness who can confirm the document access request. She paused. And there's a letter from me. Personal account of what happened with the supply routes, and the storm, and the families in the North Valley. He took the packet. It was heavier than he'd expected. Your name's on it, he said. My name's on it. He looked at her. The lamp was still burning behind her, and she looked tired in a way she hadn't fully recovered from since the Westcut climb. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there in January. They know who you are, he said. They knew who I was when I moved onto this mountain, she said. They've been looking at me since the gathering at Virgil's barn, since the Lester barn. She met his eyes directly. Calloway, if Voss reads that packet, the syndicate's operation here is finished. Finished completely, not just inconvenienced. That's worth my name on a letter. He held the packet. He thought about the 3 days of storm and Edna Brecht's cold hands and the Lester barn burning from the outside in. He thought about the letter from Haldern and Associates and its elaborate, careful language designed to make theft sound like an administrative clarification. I'll be back in 4 days, he said. I know, she said. He went to the door. He stopped. He turned around. She was watching him with the level, patient look she'd walked off the wagon with in January. The bar on the back room door, he said. I've been using it every night. Good. He put his hand on the door frame. He had a number of things he might have said, and he found, examining them briefly, that none of them were quite right, or quite sufficient, or quite honest enough given the specific situation of a man about to ride 60 miles in post-storm conditions with a packet of documents that could end a criminal enterprise, and a woman behind him who had put her name on those documents without hesitation. Don't let anyone in you don't know, he said. She almost smiled. That was always my plan. He left. The ride to the county seat took 2 days, not 1, because the road through the lower valley was worse than the mountain track in its own way. Not blocked by snow so much as obliterated by it, the wagon ruts and mile markers all uniformly white. The route navigable only by the tree lines and Rhett's compass and Cal's knowledge of the lower road from 3 years of running cattle to the county market. They slept rough the first night in the lee of an abandoned relay station, with the horses on a picket and a fire small enough to not advertise itself. Cal, eating cold biscuits that Martha had packed, said, Your wife made that packet. Yes. All of it. The timeline, the letters, the analysis of what the syndicate was doing? Yes. Cal was quiet for a moment. She's something, he said. Rhett looked at the fire. Yes, he said. The way she talked at Virgil's barn, the way she handled the gathering. Cal paused. I've seen men try to move a room like that. She did it different. How? She listened first, for a long time before she said anything. And when she said something, it was the thing everyone was already thinking and hadn't found words for. Cal turned his biscuit over in his hands. That's rarer than people think. Rhett said nothing. He was aware, sitting by that small fire in the cold, of the specific quality of the thing he had been building over 4 months without deciding to build it, the way structures sometimes went up in the doing rather than the planning. The people in Harlan Crossing, Cal said, frick in that crowd. They had her figured for a joke. I know. They weren't watching the right things. No, Rhett said. They weren't. They reached the county seat the following afternoon, a town 3 times the size of Harlan Crossing, with a proper courthouse and a land registry office, and at the end of the main street, a territorial marshal's building with a flag and 2 horses tied out front that looked like working horses rather than show. Marshal Voss was a man in his late 50s, lean and deliberate, with the quality that good lawmen sometimes had of seeming to be doing nothing while actually doing quite a lot. He received them in his office, looked at the packet Rhett set on his desk, looked at Rhett, looked at Cal, and said, "Sit down." He read for a long time. He asked 2 questions during the reading, one about the date of the document request at the county recorder's office, one about the specific language the syndicate's representative had used when he spoke to Gruber's wife. Rhett answered the first. Cal, who had heard the Gruber story from Agnes at the barn raising, answered the second. When Voss finished, he set the papers down and was quiet for a moment. "Haldern and Associates," he said. "They filed a boundary claim?" 2 months ago, Rhett said. "They filed the same claim in 2 other districts in the last 18 months, Voss said. "Different company name, same legal structure." He tapped the packet. "The woman who wrote this analysis." "Your wife?" "Yes." "She connected the document access request to the boundary claim deliberately." "Yes." Voss looked at him steadily. "That's a significant connection. Provable if we get a judge to order the records examination before they can be tampered with." He paused. "I can do that today, before I leave this office." Cal, beside Rhett, said, "There are families who've already sold. Silas Morrow. The Pettit brothers. Those are harder," Voss said. "But if the sales were made under documented intimidation, the Lester barn, the supply route interference, those transactions become contestable." He picked up his pen. "I'm going to need full written statements from the families in the North Valley. Everyone who was approached, everyone who experienced property damage. This packet is a start, not a finish." "I'll get the statements," Rhett said. Voss looked at him again. The particular look of a man assessing something he's not entirely sure about. "The Blackstone Development concern has money," he said. "Legal money. They'll fight this." "I know. It won't be fast." "I didn't expect fast." Voss nodded slowly. "All right," he said, and started writing. They rode back in better time than they'd come, because the road had been broken by their own passage and the passage of other travelers in the 2 days they'd been gone, and because Rhett was aware, in the particular way of a man returning to something rather than leaving it, of the need to cover ground. He got back to the mountain on the 4th day as he'd said he would, arriving in the early evening to find the cabin with the fire going and the lamp lit and Delilah at the table not with her notebook but with a stack of letters, opened, that she looked up from when he came in the door. She read his face. "Voss?" He filed for records examination before we left his office. He's already been to the Harlan Crossing recorder. He has the boundary claim documents and Agnes's cousin's account. Rhett took off his coat. "He wants statements from the Valley families." "I've started them," she said, and touched the stack of letters. "Martha sent word while you were gone. 7 families willing to make formal statement. 2 more who said they'd think about it." He looked at the letters. 7 families. 3 months ago, 11 families had come to the Pruitt barn gathering because Virgil had called it a gathering instead of a meeting, and half of them had come suspicious, and one of them had said, "Pretty words, don't build barns." 7 families willing to put their names to a formal statement for a territorial marshal. "How did you get 7?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. "I wrote to each of them," she said, "individually. I didn't write the same letter." He sat down across from her. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I wrote to Nora Calder about what happened to Edna Brecht, because Nora Calder is a woman who responds to other people's trouble in a specific way. I wrote to Cal's mother about what her son had done on the Westcut climb, because she needed to know what her son was capable of. I wrote to Agnes about her cousin's risk and what it might mean for the county if Voss succeeds." She paused. "People respond to different things. The same letter to everyone just tells everyone they're interchangeable." He sat with that for a moment. Outside, the mountain was doing its post-storm thing, the creak and settle of timber contracting in the cold, the particular silence of deep snow. He was very tired, the kind of tired that was in the bone, that 2 days of hard riding had put there, and that sleep would only partly address. "The syndicate's people," he said. "They'll know Voss is moving. Yes, probably already know. They'll pressure the families before statements can be made formally, which is why I asked Martha to have everyone ready to travel to the county seat within the week." She folded her hands on the table. "All of them together, not separately. Voss can take statements from 11 people in a day if they're all in the same place. He looked at her, at the stack of letters she'd written individually, each one different, each one knowing its reader. At the notebook on the shelf, at the bar he'd added to the backroom door in early February, which had been used every night she'd been in this cabin. Not because she was afraid, but because she was practical, and practical was what she'd said she was, practical first. Doyle Frick, he said. She blinked. What about him? His $2. He said it flat, without inflection, because he didn't entirely trust what was in his voice if he added any. He bet you'd be gone before February. She looked at him steadily. A long look, long enough that he felt it the way he sometimes felt the mountain, as something larger than what he could fully see from where he was standing. It's April, she said. Yes. He lost, she said. He did. She picked up the next letter from the stack and broke the seal. I'll need you to ride to the Gruber property tomorrow, she said. Mrs. Gruber, what the syndicate man said to her when her husband wasn't home. She needs to tell that to Voss, not to Martha, not to Agnes, Voss. But she'll only talk to someone she's seen before. She saw you at the barn raising. All right. Take Cal. All right. She went back to the letter. He went to the fire and sat down in his chair, the one that was his because it had always been his and had not changed, though the cabin around it had changed in the slow, accumulative way of things that change before you notice they're changing. He sat there for a while, listening to her turn pages across the room, and thought about the east cut and the west cut and the 40-degree pitch, and the sound her breathing made at the top of it, controlled and deliberate, the breathing of someone managing a hard thing rather than being defeated by it. He thought about what Cal had said by the fire. She listened first, and when she said something, it was the thing everyone was already thinking and hadn't found words for. He thought he knew now what he wanted to say. He didn't say it, not yet. The time for it wasn't tonight, when he was bone-tired and she was still working and the marshal's investigation was in motion and the Gruber property was tomorrow and 11 families needed to travel to the county seat. There was still too much in motion for the thing he wanted to say to land the way it deserved to land. But he knew what it was. He sat in his chair by the fire in the cabin that had become something different from what it had been in December, and he was aware, with the particular clarity that came sometimes after the worst of a hard thing had passed, that the mountain had given him exactly one thing he hadn't expected and hadn't deserved and didn't quite know what to do with, and that the correct response to that, the only honest one, was to not waste it. Across the room, Delilah turned another page. The fire burned. The mountain held. And in Harlan Crossing, in a marshal's file that had not existed a week ago, 11 families had become real, not isolated dots on a map that a syndicate could approach and pick off one by one, but 11 names on a shared document, connected by what they'd endured and what they hadn't let themselves be talked out of. That had a shape to it, a shape that would hold. He could see it the way he could see a structure he'd built. The joints, the load-bearing, the places where the weight distributed, and the places where it held firm. He could see where it had come from. He looked at Delilah, bent over her letters, writing in her careful hand, the lamp throwing a warm circle around her in the cold cabin. He looked for a while. He was not a man who looked at things without purpose. Then he turned back to the fire, because some things didn't need to be said out loud to be true. The 11 families rode to the county seat on a Wednesday in late April, when the road had dried enough to make the journey possible, and the mountain had finally begun releasing its grip on the season. They didn't go together because someone decided it would look impressive. They went together because Delilah had written 11 individual letters, and 11 families had each made the same decision independently, and when they arrived at Voss's office in ones and twos over the course of a morning, filling the waiting room and spilling out onto the steps, it was not a demonstration. It was just what happened when people who had been afraid separately stopped being afraid separately. Rhett stood outside the marshal's building and watched them come in. The Calders. Clark still moving carefully on his leg, but moving. Old Magnus Winslow, who had driven 60 miles alone and didn't look like it had troubled him particularly. The Gruber family, all of them, which Rhett had not expected, including Mrs. Gruber, a small, contained woman who walked into that building with the particular quality of someone who had decided to stop carrying a thing alone and had chosen today as the day to set it down. Cal Heder arrived last, with his mother in the wagon beside him. She was a broad-shouldered woman in her 60s who looked at the assembled families on the steps and said, loud enough for most of them to hear, Took us long enough. Nobody argued with that. Delilah was already inside with Voss, organizing the order of statements in the practical, invisible way she organized most things, so that by the time anyone thought to ask who had arranged it, it was already done. Rhett went in and found her at the side of Voss's main office with her notebook open, talking quietly to Nora Calder about the specific sequence of events during the storm. Nora was nodding. When Delilah saw Rhett, she gave him the look that meant things were proceeding as planned, and he should find somewhere useful to be. He found somewhere useful to be. The statements took the better part of the day. Voss was methodical and unhurried, which was either reassuring or maddening depending on the temperament of the person sitting across from him. And he had a deputy who wrote quickly and accurately and who had the sense to stay out of the way when the testimony was going somewhere significant. It went somewhere significant several times. Mrs. Gruber's account of what the syndicate's representative had said to her, alone, in her own home, with her husband in the fields, was the kind of testimony that made the room very quiet, because it was specific and detailed and delivered in the flat, factual tone of a woman who had been frightened and had decided that the most effective thing she could do with that fear was describe it exactly. When she finished, Voss looked at his deputy's notes and said, "That's coercion. That's not a civil matter." "No," Delilah said from the side of the room. She said it quietly, not with satisfaction, because this was not the kind of thing that warranted satisfaction. "It isn't." The Lester Barn testimony came next, then the Calder supply situation, then the Pettit brothers, who had sold and who had come anyway because Agnes had written to them about what the gathering was, and they'd driven 40 miles to be part of it even though their land was gone, because some things are about more than your own property. By late afternoon, Voss had what he needed to move. He told them so in this front room, standing with the assembled families around him. He was not a man who gave speeches, and he didn't give one. He said the records examination had confirmed what the packet indicated. The Blackstone Development Concern had requested access to original survey documents in 3 separate county offices in the preceding 6 months, and in 2 of those offices, documents had subsequently been misfiled or damaged in ways that a judge had already agreed looked deliberate. He said the boundary claim against Rhett's property was being suspended pending investigation. He said the sales to the Pettit brothers and Silas Morrow were under formal review, and while he couldn't promise outcomes, contested sales made under documented intimidation had a different legal character than ordinary transactions. He said all of this plainly, without drama, and then he said, "The people in this room did something that's harder than it sounds. You didn't wait for someone else to fix it." He looked briefly at Delilah when he said that. She looked at the floor. The arrest came 6 weeks later, not all at once. The law moved the way Voss moved, methodically, building each step on the one before it. The first arrest was a man named Corbin Stead, who turned out to be the operational manager of the Blackstone Development Concern's Harlan Crossing activities, and who, when the county marshal arrived at his rented office above the saloon with a warrant, made the mistake of trying to destroy a box of documents before the door was fully open. The deputy who came through the door first retrieved what he could from the papers that had already been partially burned, and what remained was sufficient. Stead talked within 24 hours, not because he was particularly weak, but because the people above him, the men whose names were on the investment structure behind the Blackstone Development Concern, had already, upon hearing that a territorial marshal had initiated a formal investigation, begun the process of ensuring that Stead would be the end of the chain if the chain had to end somewhere. He understood this. He was not a loyal man by nature, and loyalty to people who were already cutting you loose had no practical value. The names he gave went higher than the valley. One of them was a county commissioner in a district 200 miles east. One of them was a partner in the Haldern and Associates legal firm, which dissolved within the month. The actual investors, the men whose money had funded the operation, were further back still, insulated by layers of legal structure that Voss spent the better part of the summer working through. Rhett learned all of this in pieces, through Voss's occasional dispatches and Virgil's visits, and primarily through Delilah's ongoing correspondence with Agnes and Martha and Nora Calder and several other people whose information networks had proven, over the course of the spring, to be more extensive and reliable than anything the syndicate had apparently accounted for when planning their operation. The day Rhett heard that Corbin Stead had been formally charged, he was splitting wood in the yard. The same yard where he'd been standing when Hobe Kettrick's wagon came around the bend in January, carrying a woman he hadn't known what to do with. He set the axe down and stood in the May sun for a moment, feeling the specific quality of something being over. Delilah came out of the cabin and saw his face. "Stead," she said. "Charged this morning," he said. "Voss sent word." She stood in the doorway. She wasn't wearing her coat. The May afternoons had gotten warm enough that the coat stayed on the hook, and she had flour on her hands from whatever she'd been doing inside. And she looked, standing there in the door of his cabin in the spring light, like someone who had been there a long time. Not because she'd arranged herself that way, just because she had been there long enough that her presence had become part of the place's ordinary architecture. He'd been trying to say something to her for 3 weeks, since the night he came back from the county seat, since he'd sat by the fire and watched her read her letters and understood what he was looking at. He'd been trying to find the right shape for it, and the shape kept being wrong, because he was not a man who had much practice with the kind of honesty that didn't have a practical purpose, the kind you offered not because it solved a problem, but because it was true. "The formal marriage," he said. She looked at him, careful now, alert. "We said if the arrangement was workable," he said. "Both parties." "We did. It's been workable." She looked at him steadily, and he could see her reading what was beneath the word, reading him the way she'd read the gathering at Virgil's barn and the letters she sent to 11 different families in 11 different ways, finding the thing underneath the surface of the thing. "It's been more than workable," she said. "For me," he nodded. "For me too." She held his look. "That's not quite what you're trying to say." He said nothing for a moment. The axe was on the ground beside the stump. The mountain was doing what it did in May, releasing winter slowly, grudgingly, patches of snow still visible on the high north faces, even as the lower slopes ran green. He had been on this mountain for 11 years. He had never stood in this yard and tried to say what he was trying to say. "You didn't have to stay," he said, "after the first week, after the first month, any of it." "No," she said. "I didn't. The people in Harlan Crossing, I know what the people in Harlan Crossing thought. They thought you were, they didn't think you could." He stopped. He was making a mess of it, which was what happened when he tried to say things that mattered in the ordinary way people said them. He looked at her directly, the same way she always looked at him. "I was wrong about you," he said, "before you came. I had an idea of what you'd be, and I was wrong about every part of it." She was quiet for a moment. "What did you think I'd be?" "Patient," he said, "accommodating, someone who needed the arrangement more than the place. And instead? Instead, you fixed the floor and the smokehouse door, and you pulled rocks out of a creek in January, and you wrote 11 different letters to 11 different people, and you climbed a 40-degree pitch of crusted snow at dusk with a pack on your back, and you didn't say one word about it afterward." He paused. "And I don't know how to say this right, so I'm just going to say it badly. You're the most capable person I've known on this mountain, including me. And He stopped again. She waited. "I don't want it to just be an arrangement," he said. The word landed in the yard between them, in the May sun, and she looked at it for a long moment. He couldn't fully read her face. That was rare. He'd gotten good at reading her face over 4 months, but this expression was one he hadn't seen before, something that had several things in it at once, and he waited for it to resolve. "I've been waiting for you to say something like that," she said finally, "for about 6 weeks." He blinked. "Since you came back from the county seat," she said, "you've been doing that thing you do where you know what you want to say and you can't find the exact right shape for it, and you'd rather say nothing than say the wrong thing." The almost smile, except this time it was fully a smile, and not compressed at all, and he felt it somewhere in his chest like a door opening. "You're bad at that, by the way, saying things." "I know. You should practice." "I'm practicing now." "You are," she said, "and you're doing all right." He crossed the yard. He didn't do it with any particular plan except that she was standing in the doorway and he was standing in the yard, and the distance between those two places was suddenly wrong. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up slightly, and she did. And the look was the same level, unhurried look she'd given him since the first day, except that something in it had shifted, the way weather shifted. The same sky, different quality of light. He put his hand on her face, which was something he'd never done. And she let him, which was something he'd hoped for without letting himself hope for it too directly. Her cheek was warm and her expression didn't change except around the eyes, where something gave way in the specific way of something that has been held carefully for a long time and is finally, with full deliberateness, released. He kissed her. She kissed him back, which he would think about later with the kind of private, unglamorous gratitude that doesn't make for a good story, but is the actual texture of important moments. When they separated, she said, with her hands on his chest and her chin tilted up at him, "The formal marriage." "When?" "As soon as Voss is done with his paperwork," he said. "I'm not going back to the county seat twice." She laughed. A real one, full and unguarded, and it was the first time he'd heard it that way. He'd heard the compressed version, the private version, the one she deployed when something was genuinely funny, but she wasn't sure he was ready for the full extent of it. This was the full extent. It was considerably better than the compressed version. "Efficient," she said. "I'm a practical man," he said. She looked at him. "You are," she said. "Among other things." "What?" The gathering in late August was the largest the Upper Valley had seen in memory, which covered roughly 40 years in the estimation of Magnus Winslow, who was the longest-standing resident and whose memory, despite his 73 years, remained precise on matters he considered worth remembering. It happened on the Pruitt property, because Virgil had the most flat ground and Martha had the organizational capacity to feed that many people, and because the Pruitt barn had been the site of the first meeting and it felt right, in the way that some symmetries feel right without needing to be explained, to end something where it had started. People came from the whole Upper Valley and from Harlan Crossing itself, which was a thing that would not have happened 8 months ago. Because 8 months ago, Harlan Crossing and the Upper Valley settlers existed in the particular relationship of a town that found rural homesteaders convenient to dismiss, and a community that had too many individual problems to organize itself into anything capable of pushing back. That had changed. His investigation had changed it in the obvious way. Stead's arrest and the subsequent charges had made the story real, had given it the specific gravity of legal proceedings, had made it impossible to pretend it hadn't happened, or that the people who'd stopped it hadn't done so deliberately and at cost. But the change had started earlier, in the Pruitt barn in February, in the Lester barn raising, in 11 different letters going to 11 different people. Doyle Frick came. He came with the particular manner of a man who is aware that he owes a debt and has not yet worked out the correct form of payment. He found Delilah near the food tables, talking to Nora Calder, and he stood nearby for a moment in a way that she noticed but didn't respond to until he said, "Mrs. Calloway." She turned. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him steadily. "For which part?" "For—" He paused, because there were multiple parts, and he was honest enough to acknowledge that. "For the bet. For the conversation I had about you in my store, for assuming—" "You assumed what everyone assumed," she said. "You didn't have information you lacked." She paused. "What made you change your mind?" Frick was quiet for a moment. "I was at the recorder's office when Voss came for the documents. I watched what happened. I watched what he was looking at, and I understood, while I was watching, what that meant. What the syndicate had been planning to do with the whole valley, not just the upper homesteads." He looked at his hands. "I've been selling to those families for 12 years. I would have watched it happen and told myself it was none of my business." "But you didn't," she said. "I didn't," he said. "But that wasn't because of me. That was because you moved before they were ready." She looked at him for a moment. She didn't tell him it was all right, because it wasn't entirely all right, and she was not a woman who said things were all right when they weren't. But she also didn't make him stand there in his discomfort longer than the discomfort warranted. "You have sheep tallow," she said. He blinked. "What?" "The sheep tallow. I asked you to order it in January. Did it come?" Yes, it's been in the back since March. I wasn't sure you were still—" He stopped. "I'm still," she said. "I'll come by the store next week." He nodded with the expression of a man who has been let off a hook he wasn't sure he deserved to be let off. He moved away. Nora Calder, who had witnessed the entire exchange, said, "You could have made him suffer longer." "I could have," Delilah said, "but then I'd have to remember to do it every time I saw him, and that's a lot of effort for something that's already over." Nora looked at her for a moment with the look she'd had in the cabin doorway in March, something beyond ordinary gratitude, something that had been earned rather than granted. "You know what the women in this valley call you?" she said. "I have some guesses." "No," Nora said. "Not what you're thinking. They call you the one who stayed." She paused. "It doesn't sound like much when you say it out loud, but it means a great deal to the people who watch the ones before you leave." Delilah was quiet for a moment. The gathering moved around them, voices and children, and the particular warm noise of a community that had recently survived something together and hadn't yet gotten to the point of taking that survival for granted. "I didn't stay for them," she said. "I know," Nora said. "That's why it means something." Eat. Rhett found her later, when the afternoon had turned golden and the shadows of the Blackstone Range were beginning to stretch across the Pruitt property, and people had arranged themselves into the loose, contented configuration of a gathering that has accomplished its social purpose and is now simply enjoying itself. He came to stand beside her because she was standing slightly apart from the main body of people, which was where he'd always found her when she was thinking, and he'd learned to recognize the look. "Voss," she said, before he could speak, "I saw you talking to him. For 20 minutes. He stood beside her, looking out at the gathered families, the children running between adults' legs, the Lester barn visible in the middle distance looking solid and permanent in the August light. "The Morrow property," he said. She turned to look at him. "Voss says the review is complete," he said. "The sale was made under documented intimidation. Silas Morrow has a right of return if he wants it." Her hand came up and pressed against her mouth for a moment, a gesture he'd never seen from her, the involuntary kind that meant something had broken through the practical exterior. She brought her hand down quickly. "He'll want it," she said. Her voice was level, but had something underneath it that wasn't level. "Voss is writing to him this week." She nodded. She looked out at the gathering again. He stood beside her and let the silence sit, the way he'd let silences sit since January, except that this one, like most of their silences now, wasn't empty. It had weight and warmth and the specific texture of two people who had stopped needing to fill space to prove they were comfortable with each other. "The Pettit brothers," she said. "One of them wants to come back," Rhett said. "The older one, younger one settled somewhere east, might not return. But 1 out of 2. She let out a breath that wasn't quite steady. "That's not nothing." "No," he said. "That's not nothing." He thought about the morning she'd come down the mountain with rocks in her coat, fixing a floor he'd let go soft because he'd run out of a particular kind of attention for it. He thought about the certified survey copy in the box on the shelf at home, next to his deed, where it had been since February. He thought about the 40-degree pitch of crusted snow and the way her breathing had sounded at the top. Controlled, deliberate, the breathing of someone who was going to finish the thing she'd started regardless of what it cost. He had spent 11 years on that mountain alone. He had built the cabin alone, and worked the trap lines alone, and buried Cutter alone, and stood in the cold of that empty yard and felt the isolation as something neither good nor bad, just the condition of his existence. He had not known it was possible to be on the same mountain and have it be a different place. He had not understood that a place could change without its geography changing, that the same rocks and ridgelines and snowpack and pine could constitute a different world depending on who was in it. He understood it now. He understood it the way he understood things that came from experience rather than explanation. In the bone, in the blood, in the specific knowledge of someone who has been told something is possible and then watched it happen. "Delilah," he said. She looked up at him. He had been practicing, as she'd told him to. He was still not good at it. He thought he would never be good at it in the way that some men were. The ones who found words easily and deployed them naturally and seemed to understand intuitively that saying a thing out loud was not a risk but a necessity. He would always be the kind of man who had to work at it, who had to find the shape of the thing slowly and accept that the shape would be imperfect before he said it. He was all right with that now. She'd made him all right with that, not by demanding he change, but by being interested in whatever came out when he tried. "You know what I said at the barn," he said. "You said many things at the barn. The first gathering, in February." He looked at the barn across the field, where people were moving in and out of the shade of it. "I said almost nothing." "You said almost nothing," she agreed, "but you needed me there." "Yes. Not to talk," he said, "just to be there." "Yes," she said, softer now. "I didn't understand that then," he said. that being present was its own kind of, that it counted as something. He paused. I've spent a long time thinking that being useful meant doing something measurable, building something, fixing something, surviving something. He looked at her. You showed me there's a kind of useful that doesn't look like anything from the outside. It just feels different to the people who are standing in it. She looked at him for a long time. The gathering moved around them, and the mountain made its long shadow across the valley, and the light was the particular amber of August in the high country that made everything look like it was worth remembering. Rhett Calloway, she said. That might be the most words you've ever said to me in one go. I was practicing, he said. She laughed, and then she did something she rarely did in the presence of other people. She leaned into him, her shoulder against his arm, and stayed there. He put his arm around her because there was nothing else to do with it, and she fit against his side in the specific way of someone who had decided this was where she belonged and had stopped making it provisional. He held her there, in the August light, in the middle of the largest gathering the Upper Valley had seen in 40 years, and he looked at the families around him. At Cal Heder talking to Magnus Winslow, at the Calder children chasing each other through the long grass, at Nora Calder watching them with the expression of a woman who has stopped bracing for the next hard thing, at Virgil and Martha Pruitt standing near their barn with the comfortable proximity of people who have built something together and know its value. He thought about what the mountain had been when he first came to it, what he'd needed it to be, empty, demanding, indifferent, a place that asked only what he could give physically and returned only what he could take practically. He'd wanted a world without the complexity of other people's expectations, without the friction of being misread or misunderstood or found insufficient. He'd gotten something different. He'd gotten a mountain that had made him harder and more capable and also lonelier than he'd admitted to himself. And then into that mountain had come a woman that no one expected would last, who fixed floors and pulled creek stones and wrote 11 individual letters and climbed a 40-degree pitch in the dark and put her name on a document that dismantled a criminal enterprise, and who had never in all of it asked him to be different than he was, only to be present, only to be honest, only to let the place they shared mean something. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't look like courage from the outside. It doesn't roar. It doesn't draw attention to itself. It shows up in January with 2 trunks and good boots and a practical eye, and it repairs what's broken and holds what needs holding and doesn't run when the mountain shows what it costs to live there. He hadn't recognized it right away. Most people never recognized it at all. They saw the size of her and made their calculations and moved on. Doyle Frick had made his calculations. The town had made its calculations. The syndicate, in its careful mapping of vulnerabilities, had not put Delilah Boone in its ledger anywhere, because they'd looked at the Upper Valley and seen a collection of isolated individuals, and they'd been right about most of them and catastrophically wrong about one. The strength that breaks things is easy to see. The strength that holds things together, that builds alliances from individual fear, and turns 11 separate problems into one shared answer. That kind of strength is quiet and patient, and willing to wait as long as it takes for the right moment, and the people who underestimate it always pay for that mistake eventually. He'd nearly underestimated it himself. He'd looked at her and seen what she offered practically, and been grateful for it. And it had taken him months to understand that what he was actually looking at was a person whose capabilities exceeded his own in the dimensions that mattered most for survival of the kind that counted. Not survival against weather or wolves or blizzards, but survival of the kind that required other people. Community, trust, the slow, difficult work of making a place worth defending. She had made this mountain worth defending, not just to him, to 11 families who had come to a gathering in a barn in February and driven 60 miles to give statements to a marshal and helped raise a barn and climbed a ridge in a storm and decided collectively that they were not going to be the people who let it go. That was what she'd done. Not fixed it, not saved it, built it. Built something that hadn't existed before she came, out of the same materials that had always been there, just waiting for someone who knew how to see what they could become. The sun was going down behind the Blackstone Range, and the shadow of the mountain fell across the gathered families like a hand, and it was not a threatening hand. It was just the mountain being what it was, large and permanent, and asking, as it always asked, whether the people under it were equal to what it cost to stay. They were. They had proven it. Delilah stood beside him, warm against his side, and the gathering talked and laughed around them, and for the first time in 11 years, Rhett Calloway stood on his mountain and felt something he hadn't been sure he was capable of feeling. He felt at home, not in the place. He'd always felt at home in the place. He felt at home in his own life. In the specific arrangement of days that had built up around him since January, the coffee in the morning and the bar on the back room door and the notebook on the shelf and the sound of a pen moving at 2 in the morning while he put wood on the fire without being asked. In the way she looked at him across a table without needing him to explain himself. In the way she'd said, "I didn't stay for them," and Nora had said that's why it means something. He felt at home in the life he was living for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, and it was not a feeling he'd found alone. It was a feeling he'd found when someone had come up his mountain and refused to run back down it, and that refusal had turned out to be the thing that changed everything. Not the land, not the legal victory, not the Lester barn or the mining cuts or the certified survey copy in the box. The refusal. The quiet, stubborn, unapologetic refusal of a woman who had been told her whole life that she was too much in some ways and not enough in others, and who had decided somewhere along the way that other people's calculations about her were not her responsibility to honor. He tightened his arm around her. She looked up at him with the level, unhurried look she'd had since the first day, and underneath it now, say, underneath the steadiness and the practicality and the patience, was something warm and certain and entirely her own. "Ready to go home?" she said. "Yes," he said. They said their goodbyes slowly, the way you did at gatherings worth having, not rushing, letting each departure mean something because the people around them had earned that. Martha pressed Delilah's hands. Cal Heder shook Rhett's hand and then, which was unusual for Cal, didn't immediately let go. "Next gathering," Cal said. "I'll host." Rhett looked at him. "Your property's too small." "Then I'll build," Cal said, and smiled with the particular smile of a young man who has recently discovered what he's capable of and finds the discovery clarifying. "Your wife can write the invitations." "She writes 11 versions of the same invitation," Rhett said. "Fair warning," Cal laughed and let go of his hand. They drove home up the mountain road in the long summer dusk, the horses moving easily on the dry track, the Blackstone Range holding its color long past the time the valley had gone to shadow. Delilah sat beside him with her shoulder against his arm and her eyes on the road ahead, and neither of them said much, because there was nothing that needed saying that hadn't already been said or that couldn't wait until they were home. The cabin was exactly as they'd left it. The deed and the certified survey copy were in the box on the shelf. The notebook was on the table. The bar was on the back room door, though there was no longer any practical reason for it, and they both knew it, and neither of them had said anything about removing it, because some things you keep not for the reason they were put there, but because they have become, by time and use, part of what the place is. Delilah made coffee because she made the coffee now, and had since February, and this was not a thing that had been negotiated. She brought him his cup and kept hers, and they sat together in the quiet of the cabin with the fire low and the mountain outside doing what it had always done, holding everything up, asking its endless question, waiting for the answer. He thought, this is the answer. Not a perfect one, not a smooth one, a human one, built from imperfect materials by imperfect people who had not expected each other and had not been easy on each other and had found each other anyway in the ordinary daily work of a life shared on hard terrain. The mountain had shaped him for 41 years. He had thought, without ever articulating it, that what it had shaped him into was solitude, that the mountain had made him the kind of man who lived alone and was suited to it. He had been wrong. What the mountain had made him was someone who could survive until the right person came along, someone who could hold the ground until the thing worth holding it for arrived. She had arrived on a Tuesday in late January in a wool coat with mended elbows, and she had jumped down from the wagon without waiting for help and looked at his cabin the way she looked at everything, straight on, quick, no particular alarm. And she had not left. And the mountain, the same mountain that had defeated every other arrangement, that had sent 3 women back down the road before they'd learned its name, the mountain had finally found the person it couldn't drive away. It hadn't broken her. She had changed it.